Chapter 16. The Queen Dowager. A.N. Cersei and Axel have their first real conversation. XXX. The visit comes without warning and Cersei is left wondering whether she needs to get better servants. It used to be that she was one of the first to know of anything important that happened in the Red Keep. But ever since Robert's death, Cersei had begun to feel isolated. As such, when the knock at the door of her chambers comes, Cersei is caught somewhat flat-footed. Yes. What is it? Opening the door, Sir Meryn Trant looks in on her. The king is here, your grace. Says he wants to talk to you. Yes, she would very much have appreciated a heads up before such a visit. Narrowing her eyes, Cersei thinks fast. Tell him I'm not decent. Of course, if he's anything like Robert, that won't matter to him. But Cersei has heard interesting things about their young king so far. Things like how pious and polite he is, despite his newfound power. So she's not that surprised when Sir Trant comes back a moment later with a nod. He says he'll wait, your grace. Of course he will. Cersei's nostrils flare as she rises from her seat and prepares herself. She can't be too upset that Axel is here, to be fair. After all, she's been hoping to get some time alone with him for a few days now. She'd just been struggling to figure out a way to do it that wouldn't come across as too desperate on her part. But if he was coming to her, well, that changed things, didn't it? Soon enough, she's as prepared as she can be. Only once she's sure she's finally ready, does Cersei call out. Enter. The door opens a moment later. Their new handsome young bastard of a king steps into the front room of her chambers and Cersei calls to him from the next room over where she's waiting. In here, your majesty. When Axel first lays eyes on her, he tenses up and stares for all of a moment before looking away. As he strides forward, he keeps his gaze off of her, being very careful not to look in her direction. Why? That's very simple, really. Cersei hadn't used the intervening time to get decent, rather, she'd used it to dress down. Wearing nothing but an open nightgown and lounging on a couch in her bedchambers, the Queen Dowager smiles as the young king tries and fails to contain his blush. I thought you needed time to get decent, your grace. Cersei raises an eyebrow and lets her smile grow even as she affects an innocent tone. Did I say that? An awkward silence falls over the room for a moment and Cersei waits for Axel to give in and take another glance at her. Despite being on the other side of 3 births, she's still a very beautiful woman, and an experienced one too. That experience lets her know precisely how best to flaunt her beauty, just as she's doing now. Yet to her surprise, Axel doesn't look. Instead, he pulls a folded-up letter from his shirt and holds it out to her. There's been a letter from my uncle. One we believe has been copied and sent across the whole of Westeros. Curiosity piqued, Cersei takes the letter and unfolds it, quickly digesting the contents. When she's done, she's not quite sure how to feel. It's what she wanted, of course, but at the same time, she can hardly believe the audacity. Truly, Renly Baratheon is playing right into her hands and she's barely had to do a thing. Now if only she can get Axel dancing to her tune as well. This letter reeks of desperation. Renly must be quite afraid of facing justice for his actions if he's resorting to telling lies about a man as honorable as Jon Arryn. Judging by the flex of Axel's jaw, she's managed to hit the nail on the head there. Their young king is angry that Renly would dare to disparage Lord Arryn's name. Useful information, that. Lord Arryn and the rest of the small council believe that the Reach will side with him in the Stormlands. That could put us in a tough spot given how badly they outnumber the forces of the Crownlands. Ah, yes, Cersei quickly sees what's going on here and why Axel came to deliver this news to her personally. The poor dear is afraid. And he should be, shouldn't he? His greatest allies are the Vale, the Riverlands, and the North. But the Vale has a rather small population due to its geography and the Riverlands and North are both much farther away from King's Landing than the Stormlands and the Reach. Renly's only hope if he truly wants to sit on the Iron Throne, is to take King's Landing and do away with Axel before the young king's allies can rally their own armies and make the journey south. If Axel is dead and Renly is sat upon the Iron Throne by the time, say, Lord Stark arrives at King's Landing, then maybe the Lord Paramount of the North will turn his armies around and go home. Or at least, that's what Renly is counting on anyways. Cersei, unfortunately, had to listen to her late husband wax on poetically about Eddard Stark more than most. Just from what Robert had always said about Lord Stark's honor, she suspected that even if Axel died, Lord Stark would fight Renly and his armies just for the sake of putting Stannis on the throne if nothing else. Now there was an idea. If Renly won King's Landing, the war would likely continue even past Axel's death and there would be more chances for Renly and Stannis to fight and kill one another as well. Tempting, but there was one problem with that plan. Cersei couldn't say for sure what Renly might do with her and Myrcella once he had control of the city. It would probably be fine, but she didn't like the idea of risking her last child's life on a, probably. Still, it's rather obvious why Axel is here. You want me to convince my father to raise his levies and march on King's Landing so that he can reinforce the Crownlands before Renly's armies get to the city. The young king nods. I'd hoped you might write him a letter, yes. The Westerlands are in the best position to support us against my treacherous uncle. That they were. Cersei hums consideringly for a long moment, before smiling. This entire time, Axel still hasn't looked at her. Not even once. She's not even showing anything too scandalous. Just a bit of skin. You can look, you know. The young king stiffens, his eyes remaining for above the couch. It wouldn't be proper. Cersei scoffs. For all that he looks like a young Robert, he really is quite different from the man, isn't he? HMPH. You're the king now, darling. You decide what is and isn't proper. A frown flits across Axel's face for a moment. Then, it still wouldn't be proper. A huff leaves her lips and she rises from the couch, the gown she's wearing falling open further to reveal more. To his credit, Axel's gaze don't drift below her neck, even as she walks forward. Why? Because of whom my husband was. Meaningless. You and I were nothing to each other, Axel Baratheon. This is our first time so much as having a conversation. Reaching out, she trails her fingers down his chest. I've been so cold ever since. Trailing off, Cersei lets out a shuddering breath. Won't you warm me up? He looks her in the eyes and Cersei looks back, smiling coyly and seductively. She knows she has him as a shadow passes over his face. But at the same time, a shiver she can't even begin to describe runs down her spine. XXX. Wop. 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 In F fuck. Don't stop, keep going. H harder. Axel's hands are on her naked body as her flesh ripples beneath his onslaught. One on her shoulder, the other on her hip to hold her steady. The gown discarded, Cersei Lannister is naked on her bed on all fours, getting taken from behind by the young king. He's rutting her like an animal, not that she minds. She'd told him to, after all. His cock slides in and out of her at rapid speeds, and even though Cersei had started this as nothing more than a manipulation to get on Axel's good side, she finds herself enjoying everything far more than she anticipated. Her folds are slick with arousal, her insides clenching and squeezing around his pistoning prick even as he drives forward into her depths again and again. She can't even begin to say how long they've been going at it either. Hours, maybe. Cersei has never been with a man with so much stamina, and that even includes her previous lovers. Between the sizable member and the willingness to keep going again and again, Axel has managed to completely upend her initial plan. Originally, Cersei was just going to tease him a bit. Maybe give him a single fuck to tide him over before she agreed to do as he asked. She was going to make him think he earned it. Instead, it just kept going, and Cersei had yet to call for it to stop. Cersei did not consider herself a particularly lustful woman. She'd always prided herself on intelligence and cunning above all else. Certainly, she knew she was beautiful, but her beauty was simply a tool in her arsenal. It did not define her. But right now it's hard for her to think about anything but how thick and large Axel feels inside of her as he drills her from behind on her hands and knees. Clutching at the bedding beneath her, Cersei cries out in an ugly fashion yet again, a shudder running up and down her sweaty, naked form as he fills her with his shaft over and over. Suddenly, Axel pulls out and spins her over. Cersei grunts, the wind knocked out of her for a moment as he puts her on her back and spreads her legs apart. By the time she recovers, he's already inside of her again, hammering away with his throbbing mast, and leaning in for a kiss. Obviously, Cersei turns her head away, not wanting such intimacy from the younger man. She still hated him after all. She still wanted him dead. And die he would, just as soon as he'd killed Renly and Stannis for her. Fortunately, Axel doesn't take issue with her defiance. Not like Robert would have. Far from making her kiss him, he simply lowers his lips to her sensitive neck instead, sucking away at her flesh and driving Cersei even wilder as she hisses beneath him. Before she knows it, her arms and legs have started to wrap around his powerfully built body. Her legs lift up into the air, her toes curling from ecstasy as every thrust he makes brings new waves of pleasure. Her hands meanwhile, they claw at his back, her nails scratching but finding no purchase in his flesh even as she gnashes her teeth. She wants to make him bleed, but unfortunately she can't quite seem to break the skin. She's tempted to bite down on his shoulder instead but doesn't want to give him any ideas. In the end, Cersei endures. She endures the pleasure. She endures the ecstasy. She endures the big, throbbing member thrusting in and out of her at speeds she's never felt before and never knew she would enjoy quite this much. Until finally, with one last grunt, Axel yanks himself out of her while she's mid-orgasm and reaches for the closest thing to use as a rag. It just so happens to be her gown, which he wraps around his cock just as he comes, jerking off into the garment and coating it in his seed. Still, better that than her insides or her skin. Cersei lays there, trembling from a strangely satiated exhaustion, even as Axel comes down from his release and looks at exactly what he used to contain himself. Ah, apologies. I didn't want to make a mess. Plastering a smile on her face, Cersei lets out an airy sort of giggle. You have nothing to apologize for, my king. As I said before, you decide what is and isn't proper. Indeed, even if he'd decided to come in or on her, Cersei would have simply pretended to be happy with it. She's glad she doesn't have to, but one way or another, she wants to make Axel believe that she's on his side. Of course, if this doesn't convince him, she doesn't know what will. I'll pen a letter to my father immediately, Your Majesty. I'll make sure to emphasize the critical nature of all of this and insist that he moves as fast as possible. You will be able to count on House Lannister in this coming war. And she was even telling the truth too. She would indeed send that letter, because at this point Cersei had decided that Axel was the best suited for winning the upcoming battles. She would continue to use him until both Renly and Stannis Baratheon were dead, and then she would kill him herself if she had to. Her revenge wouldn't be complete until Axel Baratheon drew his last breath, but until that time came, she wouldn't be against using him for her own satisfaction every once in a while. He was certainly built for it. Speaking of Stannis, do be careful though, my king. When Axel furrows his brow in confusion, Cersei smiles more earnestly. You don't just have to worry about Renly Baratheon. He might be the most obvious threat at this point, but his lies, you should expect them to be parroted by his elder brother as well. Stannis Baratheon is unlikely to side with Renly, but he will almost certainly try to swoop in and take the Iron Throne for himself the moment that he thinks you're distracted. Frowning, Axel grunts. I was under the impression that Stannis was the honorable one, to a fault, even. But Cersei is quick to shake her head. No, that's just what he wants everyone to think. Do you really think a man who was slighted all his life by Robert Baratheon will settle for letting you have the Iron Throne? He might pretend to be loyal. He might try to convince you that he's on your side, but when you're at your weakest, when you and Renly have spent your strength against one another, that's when Stannis will strike. You should consider removing him as a threat as early as possible, before he's able to betray you, Your Majesty. For a moment, Cersei wonders if she might be able to convince the young king to send an assassin in Stannis' direction right then and there. But alas, no. Axel eventually just shakes his head and sighs before beginning to reach for his clothes. We'll see. I won't act without reason. Stannis will have a chance to bend the knee. He hasn't betrayed me yet, Renly has. Watching him get dressed, Cersei hums but doesn't try to push any harder than that. Eyes lidded, body too sore and satisfied for her to even want to move, Cersei remains where she is, a contented smile on her lips. As you say, Your Majesty. One way or another, all three remaining Baratheon men would die. By their hands, or by hers. Cersei refuses to let it be any other way. But that would come with time. For now, she was content with having nudged things in the right direction. I'm so clever and smart. Nobody can possibly comprehend my machinations, Cersei probably. Chapter 17. 5 on. Axel in the yard getting sweaty with some other men. Come on then. All 5 of you now. All at once. Clad in armor and holding his blunted training sword with one hand, Axel beckons to the 5 men in front of him with the other. The 5 knights, all dressed in their own armor and wielding their own blunt swords, share a look before lunging forward to strike at him from all different angles in a mildly impressive display of coordination and effort. As Axel dodges, ducks, and weaves while blocking and deflecting at the same time, he finds his mind wandering even as not a single one of the 5 knights manages to land a single blow on him. The worst part is the waiting. Axel has decided. He's king of the 7 kingdoms and yet all he can do is fucking wait. It's been some time since Renly Baratheon all but declared war with that damn letter. Time spent waiting for letters to travel back and forth across Westeros by Raven. All to find out where everyone stands with one another, and more importantly where everyone stood with him specifically. Axel has done his best to keep busy, of course. He's continued to spar with anyone willing to cross blades with him, and in doing so he's gathered a fine selection of passable knights who might one day become members of his Kingsguard. He hones them each and every day, pushing them to their limits and then a little bit further with every bout, just as he is right now. Going on the offensive for just a moment, Axel moves into one of his opponent's swings and grabs his sword arm by the wrist before solidly thumping his chestplate with his sword. The man goes down on his back and doesn't get up, all of them knowing that such a blow would have been fatal if Axel weren't holding back and had live steel in his hands. Everyone tenses up, even as Axel's mind wanders once more. There's also the Great Sept, which Axel has made a point to visit on the daily, speaking with the High Septon or one of his subordinates whenever possible. He was always a faithful devotee to the seven who were one back in the Vale, of course, but never as much as he's become now. But then to be fair, Axel isn't just doing it to keep up appearances. He himself wants to believe that the seven have blessed him. The alternative is that he's some sort of monster or demon, an inhuman thing wearing the skin of a man. Eventually, he might not be able to hide his true nature anymore, especially if it really does come to war with Renly. Axel isn't sure he can hold back just to hide his true nature while thousands of men die for him. When that time came, Axel wanted to be on the faith's good side, no matter what. The remaining 4 knights pull back for a moment and regroup. Axel lets them do so with an approving nod, even as some squires scurry onto the training field from the side and help the defeated knight get out of the way. Pretending not to listen in as the 4 plan out a joint attack in whispered voices from a dozen paces away, Axel prepares himself for their charge. Of course, if everyone were to find out about Axel's other activities, then his rapidly developing reputation as a pious and vigilant king would probably be put to the test. After all, even if there was no relation between him and Cersei Lannister, it still probably wasn't a very good look for the new king to be fucking the Queen Dowager on the regular. Axel couldn't seem to help himself though. It wasn't really a matter of self-control, but more that Cersei had proven to be far too seductive by half. She was a very beautiful woman despite her age, and Axel had found himself drawn into her games before he could really stop and think. It wasn't like he was a virgin or anything like that. No, there had been plenty of women back in the area who Axel had taken to bed. Not to mention the women among the mountain clans who had proven fierce and all the more enjoyable for it. Cersei though, Cersei was a cut above the rest. She knew it too, and the cunning woman wielded her beauty like a fine scalpel. Jon had warned Axel about her more than once at this point, but Axel found himself going back for more time and time again all the same. And when he didn't go to Cersei, she tended to come to him, showing up in his chambers and in his bed more times than he could count at this point. He was always careful not to come inside, of course, and she wholeheartedly agreed that such a thing was in neither of their best interests. Even still, she'd become something of a presence in his day-to-day life. Finally, the 4 knights break apart and begin moving in. Perhaps they think that his patience has limits. Perhaps they really are just done planning. Either way, it doesn't really matter. They come at him, and while Axel is careful not to show his true strength or speed, he also isn't about to let any man knock him on his ass. He just doesn't have it in him. Ducking under a swing from one knight, blocking the blow from another, Axel again picks his target from the 4. He meets the man's eyes and sees the moment that the knight recognizes himself as Axel's prey, his pupils dilating and his entire body freezing up. Not exactly Kingsguard material, but Axel can't exactly blame the man for recognizing when he's outmatched. Still, another clang sounds out as Axel strikes him in what would have been a mortal fashion, and he's subsequently taken out of the fight. At least the news from the rest of the 7 kingdoms has been good, mostly. Almost all of the lords of the realm outside of the Stormlands and the Reach have now sworn loyalty to Axel by way of Raven. Meanwhile, the lords of the Crownlands have all managed to make the trip to King's Landing at this point and sworn their loyalty in person. Even Axel's other uncle, Lord Stannis Baratheon, sent a letter announcing his imminent arrival in the city by boat, as well as swearing loyalty and decrying Renly's words as nothing more than power-hungry lies. Despite Cersei claiming that Stannis was almost certainly going to betray Axel eventually, Jon had advised him that Stannis was trustworthy to a fault. The man didn't have a capacity for subterfuge. Of course, Cersei just said that was what Stannis wanted everyone to think, but Axel was getting better at reading between the lines with her. She was a very opinionated woman, but that did not mean her opinions were always correct. Straightening up, Axel looks to the 3 remaining knights and smiles. This is where I would normally advise you to surrender. But it's not much of a spar if we don't fight until the last, no. Come on. Remember, this isn't about comparing yourself to me. This is about comparing yourselves to the you of yesterday. That was the philosophy he had been trying to instill into his sparring partners here in the Red Keep. It wasn't about beating him. It was about beating your past self. Continue improving, continue growing stronger, and there was nothing anyone with brains could say about you or your skill. Axel can see a sense of resigned determination and grim resolve wash over the 3 remaining knights in front of him. They all know how this ends. But sometimes it's about the journey, rather than the destination. With a series of shouts and battle cries, they throw themselves at him from 3 different directions. Smiling, Axel meets their charge, staying on the defensive for a moment to allow them to practice their technique against a far superior opponent. Meanwhile, he finds himself thinking about the Reach and the Stormlands. Just as he'd been advised would happen, the Reach had not only failed to swear loyalty by Raven, but they'd also gone and sworn for Renly instead. Lord Mace Tyrell had penned his own set of letters signaling that he believed Renly's claims and naming Renly as the rightful ruler of the 7 kingdoms. Never mind that Stannis still lived, it didn't seem like that mattered too much to Mace, because apparently his daughter Marjorie was to marry Axel's traitorous uncle and he himself was to be Renly's hand. Even though Renly held neither the Iron Throne nor King's Landing, he seemed intent on making an ass of himself anyways. They said he wore a crown upon his head with stag antlers, and that he styled himself as a king with Marjorie Tyrell as his queen. Frowning at the thought, Axel sweeps the legs out from one of the 3 remaining knights, sending him to the ground. Unlike the first 2 however, he doesn't deliver a killing blow. Instead, he holds himself back into their credit. The other 2 knights who are still standing immediately leap to their comrade's defense, blocking him off and pushing him back. He lets them do so, of course, even as the one on the ground begins to struggle back to his feet. It was all just a little bit infuriating for Axel. Here he was with all of this power and all of this strength and all he could do was wait. The temptation to just go and nip the problem in the bud with his own 2 hands grew stronger every day, but Jon cautioned patience and Axel knew he was better off listening to the older man. If he wasn't careful, he could easily be exposed as an inhuman monster in the eyes of the people. And then his only choices would be to rule as a tyrant and rely on fear to keep everyone in check, or abdicate altogether. And Axel didn't want to rule by fear if he didn't have to, so for the time being, he would continue to lean on Jon. There was a reason that Robert had made Jon his hand and kept him in that position for more than 20 years after all. Although, that was another thing that Axel had been learning a lot about since becoming king. His predecessor, Robert Baratheon, was his father after all, even if he'd never gotten to meet the man. He was also king of the 7 kingdoms for more than 20 years, a feat that Axel felt had to be acknowledged, right? Only, from everything Axel had learned, the successes of Robert Baratheon as king of Westeros could be far more easily laid at the feet of Jon Arryn instead. If it wasn't for Jon's stewardship as Robert's hand, Axel isn't really sure that the realm would have survived his father's leadership. Whoremongering, excessive drinking, excessive eating. Robert Baratheon might not have been as bad as the Mad King, but that wasn't to say he was very good either. Axel could read between the lines quite easily. Robert was a failure as a king. Soon, it's 3-on-1 again. Axel doesn't push, allowing his remaining opponents to make the big moves instead. They're trying their best of course, but Axel is like a wall before them. And, they're all getting tired. That's the thing about fighting against him. Even when he's sandbagging, even when he's holding himself back as much as possible, he never slows down. He never gets exhausted. Frankly, Axel can't remember the last time he's been tired. And it certainly won't be today as he blocks a shaky sword with his own and sends the man who swung it stumbling backwards. They're all doing everything to try and take him down. They're pulling out all the stops. But none of them are anywhere near his level, even when he's holding back. Needless to say, Axel didn't intend to follow in his father's footsteps. He was already trying to do everything in his power to be different from Robert. He took daily lessons with Jon Arryn, and while he knew he was leaning on the aging hand as much as Robert did, at least Axel had a good excuse in that he'd been nothing more than a bastard just a short time ago. More than that, he fully believed he had an awareness that he feels like his father lacked. Jon wasn't getting any younger and stewarding Robert's kingship had already taken some of the best decades of the Lord of the Vale's life. Axel wanted to learn to be the best king that he could be as fast as possible so that eventually, Jon could retire to the Vale and live out the rest of his years presiding over his own lands, as any noble lord should be able to do. With a grunt, Axel finally starts moving towards ending the spar. And once he decides that sort of thing, well, the spar ends. He sweeps the same man's legs out from under him, and this time the knight doesn't get up. He slams an armored fist into the chest of another man and he goes down as well. And finally, his sword smacks into the helm of the third just hard enough to send him stumbling backwards to land right on his ass. In barely a handful of seconds, he ends the spar, standing there breathing evenly as he looks down at the 5 men he's just fought single-handedly. You all did well. You should be proud of your progress, each and every one of you. Since he's the king, they all find the strength to mutter some form of polite thanks to him before he turns and leaves the training field behind. Of course, before Axel could learn everything Jon had to teach him and then let the older man retire to the Eyrie, they had to deal with Axel's treacherous uncle and the Reach. Which brought him right back to his previous thought about the worst part about being king so far. Waiting. The lords of the Crownlands were gathering their levies, of course, but it was a paltry sum compared to the rest of Westeros. The Vale, the Riverlands, and the North were also calling up their levies, but they would probably be too late to matter given the rate at which the Stormlands and the Reach were said to be moving. Unless, of course, the Westerlands arrived in time. Lord Lannister had sworn loyalty and even said he would start gathering his forces, but he had been rather vague on when his armies would reach King's Landing, making no promises and offering no guarantees. If Renly and Lord Tyrell made it to King's Landing before anyone else could, they wouldn't simply win out of hand, but it also wouldn't be good for Axel's side either. They would lay siege to the city and begin starving King's Landing. And given the city had a population that still seemed unbelievable to Axel, people would suffer greatly from such tactics. He hated that he wasn't able to just go out and handle it himself like he had back in the Vale with the mountain clans, but for now at least, he needed to keep his true capabilities under wraps. It was one thing to be able to best 5 men by himself in the training yard, it was another entirely if he went and fought an entire army. Did he think he could win if he tried such a thing? Maybe, and part of Axel ached to find out. But even if he did win, everyone would know at that point. They would know what Axel was truly capable of, and they might not believe him to be blessed by the 7 at that point. If the people of Westeros decried him as demon, it wouldn't matter how strong he was. He would be shunned, disavowed, and hunted. Axel didn't fear the steel of 1,000 men, truth be told. But Jon had been teaching him the strength of mere words and what they could potentially do. Fuck it, he was going to go visit Cersei again. He needed to take his mind off all the waiting, and if nothing else, the Queen Dowager was very useful for that. I definitely tried to do things a little bit differently with this chapter. Not sure I quite succeeded, but ah well, here we are all the same law. Chapter 18. Margaery Tyrell. Margaery Pav. It was rather unusual for a queen to travel to war with her king. But then, it was equally unusual for a king to be without his throne as well. And Margaery Tyrell refused to be sidelined any longer. For years now, Margaery had gotten older and older, well past the normal age for a maiden of her lineage and pedigree to be married off. To be fair, it wasn't like she was chomping at the bit to be wed to just anyone or anything like that. No, she'd always been fully on board with her father's plan to try to have her marry the crown prince. But Joffrey Baratheon was dead now, as were his father and younger brother to boot. In the wake of such tragedies, opportunity had presented itself. And House Tyrell had not gotten to where it was today by refusing to seize such opportunities. Now here they were, moving up the Rosa Road, having just passed over the Mander River and through the town of Bitterbridge. They'd be within sight of the Kingswood soon enough, where the Stormlands armies would meet up with them before they moved on towards King's Landing. Looking out the window of her carriage as they travel down the road, Margaery finds mounted knights and soldiers on foot in both directions, as far as her eyes can see. The men of the Reach, answering her father's call to war. Hopefully it wouldn't come to that, of course. That was part of how she'd convinced her father that she should be allowed to come along. They were moving fast, extremely fast. And between the Reach and the Stormlands, they had a combined force that would have beggared most other kingdoms. The Reach was Westeros' breadbasket, a fertile and heavily populated land with both food and men aplenty. Meanwhile, the Stormlands were said to produce some of the finest knights in the entirety of the 7 kingdoms. Together, they were unstoppable. And if their enemies knew what was good for them, they would realize that swiftly enough once they all arrived at King's Landing. Or so Margaery hoped. She had to admit, she was still a little nervous about all of this. Oh, it was far too late to back out now, but when she sees her brother nearby on his horse, she can't help but call out to him. Loras. The Knight of Flowers, now promoted to Lord Commander of the Rainbow Guard, Renly's version of the Kingsguard, looks over with a smile spreading across his comely face. Maneuvering his horse over to the side of her trundling carriage, he gives her a nod. Sister. How are you? Is the road treating you well? There's some concern in his voice at the end there. Marjorie titters and shakes her head. The road is treating me just fine, brother. I'm in a comfortable cushioned carriage, after all. If I couldn't handle this much, then I had no right persuading father to let me come along in the first place. Loras just smirks at that. Let you. You're the queen now, Marjorie. Our Lord Father doesn't let you do anything anymore. Only our king can tell you no at this point. But then to be fair, our father didn't really have the ability to say no to you before all of this either, now did he? Marjorie smirks right back, sharing a moment of amused appreciation for how easy their father was to bend to their will. Then, she bites her lower lip and gives Loras her most plaintive look. Brother, do you think you could ride with me for a time and keep me company in my carriage? The long-suffering look that Loras gives her makes it obvious he knows exactly what she's doing. And yet, despite that, he breaks all the same. Marjorie doesn't just have their father wrapped around her finger, after all. With a weary sigh, Loras looks around for a moment before calling over a nearby squire to take his horse for him. After dismounting and handing over the reins, he climbs up into Marjorie's carriage, armor and sword and all. There's just enough room for the two of them thanks to all of that, but also thanks to Loras' slight figure and the fact that his armor is less bulky than most. It's made to look pretty after all, just as pretty as he is. Once they're both fully ensconced in her carriage and the carriage itself is moving down the road again, Loras sits back and raises an eyebrow at her. All right, sister, what did you want to ask? Marjorie playfully pouts a little bit, folding her hands in her lap and acting every bit the prim and proper lady for a moment. Do I have to have something I want to ask, dear brother? Can't I just want your company for a time? But Loras isn't having it. He simply raises an eyebrow silently, making his intentions to wait her out abundantly clear. Finally, Marjorie lets out a huff and rolls her eyes. Fine. I wanted to talk to you about Renly's plans. We're moving rather fast, aren't we? He's rushing to reach King's Landing before anyone else. Loras hesitates but ultimately nods. It's the only way we're going to win the Iron Throne without bloodshed. Our king clearly sees the path to victory. We're on it right now. Marjorie resists the urge to roll her eyes at Loras' instinctive ass-kissing. It's just us, Loras. I'm Renly's wife and queen. And you are his closest friend and Lord Commander to his Kingsguard. You don't have to be so formal about things. Tell me though, what will we do if the rest of Westeros unites against us? What is the plan if we can't take the city in time, or even if we take the city and then they come to take it back? Again, her brother hesitates. Marjorie doesn't take it personally though. She loves her brother and she knows he loves her back, but Renly and Loras, well, they're a bit more than close friends, as she well knows. But she's not the enemy here. In fact, in the same way that Loras is Renly's sword and shield against physical threats, Marjorie is their shield against other types of threats. By marrying Renly and eventually producing an heir for him, there will be nobody who will be able to call their king a sword swallower any longer. Not if they know what's good for them anyways. Finally, Loras just sighs. Sure, Renly's claim to the Iron Throne might be tenuous at best on paper, but when he shows up at the city gates with all the men of the Stormlands and the Reach at his back, well, that will change things dramatically. Marjorie nods to show she's following along. The Crownlands simply don't have enough people to field a force capable of repelling us. And the Vale, the Riverlands, and the North are all a bit too far away to get to King's Landing in time to make a difference. That all lined up with what Marjorie knew as well. However, there was one fly in the ointment she couldn't stop thinking about. But what about House Lannister? The Westerlands are the same distance from King's Landing as us. While we have a head start, the city could hold out long enough for them to arrive. And then from there, they would just have to hold out until the others arrived. And the last I heard, Lord Tywin has sworn for Renly's nephew, no. Far from looking worried or concerned, Loras' smile just grows as he nods. He did, yes. However, the old lion is a smart man. Think about it, Marjorie. Sure, he could call his levies, rally his men, and march on King's Landing. He could set himself up as a bulwark between us and the city and force us into costly battles to boot. We'd win those battles of course, we would still outnumber the combined forces of the Westerlands and the Crownlands by almost twice their number, but it would be a lot of dead men on both sides. Marjorie narrows her eyes, noticing how Loras is, well, not all that upset by the idea. Seeing the look on his sister's face, the Knight of Flowers laughs. It won't happen, Marjorie. Remember what I said at the beginning. Tywin Lannister is a smart man. More than that, he's a selfish man to boot. Yes, he swore allegiance to Axel via Raven, just like the rest. And yes, he's uniquely positioned to help out the enemy. But in doing so, all he would do is harm his own lands. The Lannister armies would be bled dry just to weaken us so that the Vale, Riverlands, and North could sweep in after the fact to clean us up. And Lord Tywin would never stand for something like that. Huh. Her brother had a point, didn't he? Tywin Lannister had not gotten his house to the prominence it was today by being reckless or foolhardy with the lives of his knights and small folk. He had a reputation as a strategic and cunning lord, and while he could rush in and save the day for their enemies, it could cost him everything in the process. So why would he? Well, Marjorie could think of two reasons. What about Cersei Lannister and Myrcella Baratheon? Won't Tywin have to act for their sake? But again, Loras just shakes his head and grins. Renly has made sure that the old lion won't be feeling that desperate. He sent the one letter detailing Jon Arryn's lies and Axel Stone's illegitimacy to everyone, including Castle Rock. But he sent a second, more personal letter to Tywin Lannister. One that made it clear that if Tywin dragged his heels, Renly would make sure no harm came to Queen Cersei or Princess Myrcella in the taking of the city. Looking quite pleased with his lover's cunning, Loras leans back again and shrugs. After all, Myrcella is Renly's precious niece, and Cersei Lannister has nothing to do with Jon Arryn and Axel Stone's plot to usurp the Iron Throne. Why would he be any threat to them? All the Lannister lord has to do is slow down a little bit, pretend like he's going as fast as he can, and let us finish what we have to do before he ever reaches King's Landing. Narrowing her eyes, Marjorie tilts her head to the side, giving her brother a pointed look. And will he? Rolling his own eyes back at her, Loras huffs. Our scouts say that's exactly what he's doing. The Lannister armies haven't even left the Westerlands yet. Sure, they didn't have as much warning as we did, but they could have moved faster if the old lion really wanted them to. He's dragging his feet, sister. Once we arrive at King's Landing and that poor bastard that Jon Arryn has stuck on the Iron Throne sees how large our armies are, he'll surrender. Pausing, Loras grimaces. Hopefully he'll do so without us having to kill any of the Crownlands men in the process, given that they're just doing what they're told to do. But if blood must be shed, let it be our enemies, not our own. Yes, that much Marjorie could agree with. She was confident in her brother's skills, but she would still rather he not have to fight if it wasn't necessary. Especially since up until this point, pretty much all of Loras' battles had been in tourneys. He'd never been in a real war, but of course Marjorie wasn't going to bring that up. Loras still had his pride as a knight, after all. Thank you for speaking with me, brother. You've done a lot to settle my worries. Loras graces her with a broad smile, reaching out and placing a hand over hers for a moment. Of course, sister, anytime. They stop the carriage again soon after and let Loras off so he can retrieve his horse and they can continue on their way. As Marjorie is left alone with her own thoughts once more, she can't help but purse her lips together. It's a good plan, she thinks. Probably the best plan they have at this point. Even with all their strength, the Reach and the Stormlands alone cannot hope to stand against 4 other kingdoms united. But if they reach King's Landing early enough and can starve the city out, then they can claim the Iron Throne without having to fight anyone. And as her grandmother always liked to say, if you could take possession of something, you've already won half the battle. All the same, Marjorie does find herself with some regrets. For one, as eager as she was to be acknowledged as Queen of the 7 Kingdoms by the whole of Westeros, she was well aware that Renly would never truly be able to perform with her in bed. They would make sure he had an heir eventually, of course, but it was rather telling of the state of things that they hadn't even consummated their marriage yet. She'd been promised that she could take a lover of her own once Renly's position as king was truly secure, but Marjorie didn't really care too much about that. Oh, she would certainly take her new husband up on that offer eventually because she wasn't about to let him and Loras have all the fun, but it definitely wasn't at the forefront of her mind. Still, even now a part of her can't help but wish they didn't have to crush young Axel Stone like this. She's heard rumors that Jon Arryn's puppet king is quite handsome and looks a lot like his father before the years started to add up. Privately, in the sanctity of her own mind, Marjorie thinks to herself that it might have been nice if she could have married Axel instead. But life is not a fairy tale, obviously. And she would do her duty, both to House Tyrell, and to the Seven Kingdoms. XXX. More of the enemy's plan is laid out now. But can it really work out like they hope for? Chapter 19. Small Council Perspectives. A small council meeting. Also the Manus finally arrives. XXX. Yet again, they find themselves waiting for the Grandmaster to make his way to the small council chambers. Yet again, Jon finds himself considering whether it might be time to send another letter to the Citadel and see if they would finally retire Pycelle and send someone younger to replace him. The man had been Grandmaster for over 40 years now and served more kings than most people alive had ever even seen. Whether his service was worthwhile or not was debatable, but there was no denying that he'd been around for a long time. Too long. Unfortunately, given the current climate, Jon knew he couldn't waste time trying to get Pycelle replaced at the moment. Maybe after this whole mess with Renly was handled, but maybe not even then. After all, once Renly was dealt with, there would be a dozen other things the realm had to handle first before they tried to force the Citadel to make any kind of decision on a reasonable timetable. As the aging Grandmaster finally makes it to his seat, Jon looks around the room, huffing to himself. They were still missing a Lord Commander of the Kingsguard as well as a Master of Laws. To be fair, the Kingsguard was still reduced to just 2 men after all the deaths, both of whom were effectively assigned to the Queen and Princess full-time at the moment. At least Stannis Baratheon had finally arrived in King's Landing. The stoic and ever-frowning man is in his seat at the table, looking like he'd rather be continuing his rallying the royal fleet at the moment rather than sitting here. Knowing full well that Stannis wouldn't want him to make a big deal about his presence, Jon just gives the Master of Ships a single nod, which he returns. As for the position of Master of Laws, the position should probably have been refilled by now, but there'd simply been no time with everything that was going on. At least Varys, Petter, and Pycelle are all in attendance each time he calls a meeting. Small mercies, that. Let's talk good news first. As of today, it is believed that the last of the wildfire caches left behind by the Mad King have been removed from King's Landing. I think we can all rest a little easier now, no longer having to wonder if there might be green flames just lying in wait beneath our feet. There are nods from the other 4 men at that, the relief in the air palpable. Stannis perhaps a little bit less so given he'd been gone for so long, but he'd still lived in the city for most of the past 2 decades. After a moment of silent appreciation, Jon continues on. Furthermore, the lords of the Crownlands have finished rallying and now wait at Hayford Castle for further orders. They can be to King's Landing within hours if we call for them. Of course, one might wonder why they hadn't called for them yet, but the answer there was simple. The Crownlands were not a true kingdom, and thus did not have a true kingdom's strength. The amount of men gathered at Hayford Castle numbered just over 10,000, but while that was a paltry sum compared to the numbers that some of the kingdoms could field, it was still 10,000 more mouths to feed than King's Landing was ready for. Jon had done what he could to prepare as soon as Renly's first letter had arrived and the true depth of his treachery was understood. King's Landing had been on rations for weeks at this point, and they'd been stockpiling what food they could in preparation for a siege. More and more, it was looking like they would need it, because the 10,000 men of the Crownlands currently garrisoning at Hayford Castle would not be nearly enough to fight off the combined forces that the Stormlands and the Reach were said to have gathering in the Kingswood. As well. From what our Master of Ships has told me, the royal fleet is also coming together quite swiftly and more ships are being built to reinforce it as fast as possible, yes. Stannis simply nods his head. Indeed. I have rallied my vassals on the narrow seas and had them turn their able-bodied small folk to either crewing or construction. We will have naval superiority over my treacherous younger brother if nothing else. Oh. What about the Redwyne fleet? Are you not worried at all? Baelish cutting in and asking such an antagonistic question makes Jon want to sigh. But at the same time, it is a question they need an answer to. That's something even Stannis himself seems to understand as he scowls at the Master of Coin across the table. It will take time for House Redwyne to get their fleet mobilized and all the way from the Arbor to here. As well, while the Stormlands have harbors, they are not as large as the Arbor and will not be suited for resupplying and repairing a fleet as large as the Redwyne fleet. Furthermore, my foolish younger brother has rushed things to such an extent that I'm not sure if the vast majority of the Redwyne fleet has even left the Arbor yet. When they do finally come, the royal fleet will be ready. Relieving to say the least, but Jon can't help his shoulders slumping slightly. Unfortunately, that may be where the good news ends. While my men in the Vale and Lord Tully's forces in the Riverlands expect to meet at Derry soon enough, the North will be further behind them due to the sheer distance involved. And the less said about the Westerlands, the better. That was a matter of no small amount of frustration to their young king, all things considered. Frankly, Jon didn't understand it. He'd seen some of the letters Cersei had written to her father. He'd sent them by Raven himself, even. And from what he'd heard, Tywin Lannister was calling his levies and gathering them together at Lannisport. However, there was simply no denying that the old lion was dragging his feet. It reminded Jon of the last time around, with Robert's rebellion. Tywin had taken his time there too, calling up his banners, marshalling his armies, and marching on King's Landing. To reinforce it. Some certainly believed that, but in the end he'd been the one to take and sack the city before Robert, Jon, and the other rebel lords could even arrive. The difference this time around was that the Lannister lord's daughter and granddaughter were both in the city. One would think, all things considered, that Tywin would have been considered their safety of the utmost importance and moved faster to help them. Admittedly, even if he had, well, the Lannister armies alone, even reinforced by the forces from the Crownlands, would not have been able to defeat the combined armies of the Stormlands and the Reach in open combat. However, they could have held them off long enough for the Vale, Riverlands, and even the North to eventually arrive and put an end to this farce. Tywin Lannister delaying his departure from Lannisport and taking his time could quite literally mean the difference between victory or defeat, though Jon would be damned if he didn't do everything in his power to make sure that wasn't true. Clearing his throat, Varys speaks up with an apologetic smile. To add on to the bad news, my little birds whisper that Renly Baratheon and Mace Tyrell's forces have made contact in the Kingswood at this point. They will be upon the city any day now. Jon grunts, giving the spymaster a nod. Yes, what scouts they'd sent into the Kingswood had reported the same thing, those who had managed to come back alive anyways. Unfortunately, they'd all but lost control of those woods at this point. The last confirmed news that Jon had heard was of the massive caravans the Reach used to transport their armies reaching the edge of the woods from their end of things. It might be worth considering whether we can hold the city at all at this point. Perhaps a retreat north would allow for us to meet up with the armies forming there. Then, we could come back and retake the city with overwhelming numbers. Lord Baelish's suggestion hangs in the air for a long moment, silence falling as the other men at the table all pause to look at him. Stannis in particular looks disgusted with Petter's perceived cowardice. But the truth is, his idea isn't a bad one on the face of it. However, when one looks just a layer beneath the surface, it quickly becomes untenable. Jon shakes his head with a sigh. No. Logically, your plan is a good one, Lord Baelish. But the lords of Westeros are not always logical creatures. Losing King's Landing and the Iron Throne would shake the confidence that the lords of the great houses have in our new king. Allowing Renly to take the city would be ceding him far too much ground. We would be giving him legitimacy he does not deserve. Not to mention, it might be exactly the sort of thing that would cause Tywin to doubt their ability to deal with these traitors. So far, this technically wasn't much of a war yet. There'd been no battles and the only blood shed at this point was nameless scouts lost in the Kingswood. But fleeing from King's Landing would be like losing a battle that they didn't even try to fight. It would give Renly the sort of victory he needed to push forward his claim on the crown. And of course, it would give him the Iron Throne. None of that could be allowed to happen, but most importantly of all, Jon knew that Axel would never go for it. Even disregarding what the lords of Westeros might think of him for what would appear to be cowardly rather than smart, the young king would rather throw himself at Renly's army alone than flee in the opposite direction. Indeed, Jon had found himself forced to talk Axel out of any unannounced trips into the Kingswood multiple times at this point. He'd made the mistake of letting the king know about the deaths of their first scouts, and ever since Axel had been gnashing his teeth over those men dying for him. They'd died in his place, at least in his eyes. No, fleeing is out of the question. This is King's Landing, the capital of the Seven Kingdoms in the heart of Westeros. We will make our stand herein. Before he can finish his sentence, the door to the small council chambers suddenly opens, a young guardsman completely out of breath rushing into the room. There's some alarm from the others, even as Jon Arryn rises to his feet. What is the meaning of this intrusion? Report. Catching his breath after a moment, the young man swallows thickly and lifts his head, showing wide, fearful eyes. They're here, my lord. The Stormlanders, the Reach, they're here. Damn. XXX. The small council ends rather quickly after that, which is good because Petter has so many things to do he doesn't even know where to begin. He had not expected Renly's forces to arrive quite so soon. In truth, he'd thought he had a few more days before they would come pouring out of the Kingswood. But no, they were here, and they were quickly moving to surround the city and cut off all traffic. King's Landing was officially under siege. This in and of itself was not necessarily a bad thing. Petter had been preparing for a siege for weeks now. In fact, in one way, it was a very good thing indeed. Before Robert's death, the primary way in which Petter had siphoned funds from the royal treasury was via the grandiose banquets, feasts, parties, and tourneys that the fat king had insisted on hosting. After Robert's death, all of that had stopped, but paying for the removal of all those wildfire caches underneath King's Landing had made for an excellent way to continue siphoning more coin for himself out of the Red Keep's coffers. After all, it was so very easy to pay a cleanup crew one sum, say he'd paid them another larger sum, and pocket the difference for himself. Especially since he was in charge of the books. Now with the wildfire caches removed however, Petter was once more in need of a suitable distraction to keep Jon from looking too closely at said books. This siege would be perfect for that, as would the opportunities it brought with it. In truth, he had known Lord Arryn would reject his proposal that they run away. After all, it was the most obvious and rational choice at this point. Sure, they had King's Landing, but they didn't have the men to hold it. Renly did. Giving it to him, going and joining up with their allies up north, and then coming and taking it back, well, it just made sense. Which was exactly why Petter knew Jon wouldn't go for it. And the man even understood that it was a good idea, hey, just as he understood all the reasons it was also a bad idea. It was almost enough to make Petter respect the hand of the king. Almost. Regardless, this siege might be a little bit ahead of schedule, but Petter would be damned if he wasn't going to still take advantage of it as much as possible. And that meant getting a move on, because those opportunities weren't going to seize themselves. XXX. Varys watches on his little finger scurries out of the Red Keep like a rat fleeing a sinking ship. Or maybe more like a rat trying to sell that sinking ship to some unsuspecting rube. His so-called rival was almost certainly going to do everything he could to make coin off of this siege. Meanwhile, Varys still isn't entirely sure what side he's on. Oh, he's more on Axel's side than Renly's at the moment, of course. All of his previous reasons for not wanting Renly as king continued to remain true. Meanwhile, studying Axel Baratheon over these last several weeks had been interesting to say the least. So far, the young man was a better king than his father had been. Some might say that wasn't a very high bar to clear, but given Axel's youth and inexperience, it was still impressive. That didn't mean he wasn't without his faults though. The sexual relationship with Cersei Lannister was, most definitely not advisable. It might not be quite as bad as whoring and drinking the nights away like Robert had done, but it was still pretty up there. Axel had most definitely inherited Robert's love for fine women at a minimum. There was also his strength of arms. Many would be aghast if they ever found out that Varys considered Axel's immense strength and speed to be a flaw, but in his eyes, it was highly suspicious. Certainly, the young king did his best to hide his power, to merely come across as an exceptionally talented young warrior. But Varys knew better. The claim, of course, was that he was blessed by the Seven. The problem with that was a matter of faith, Varys supposed. On the one hand, he knew for a fact that magic was real. On the other hand, he'd spent the last 30 years on Westeros, serving under 3 different kings. And not once in all that time had Varys seen a single sign that the 7 who were one were real. He'd seen no miracles, he'd seen no AWE-inspiring events. As far as he was concerned, the faith of the 7 was built upon a shared belief in certain values. The gods themselves had never been very relevant, at least from Varys' perspective. Even if the 7 had blessed Axel with inhuman strength, speed, and constitution, that raised another question. Why? For what reason or purpose would the 7 lift up Robert Baratheon's bastard son in such a way? No, magic seemed more likely. The question then became if Axel was the practitioner, or the victim. This too might seem strange to anyone else if they could hear Varys' thoughts. How could someone like Axel be a victim? But Varys knew better. And so far, their young king hadn't done a single thing to make him seem like a sorcerer. There had been no profane rituals, no blood sacrifices beneath the Red Keep, nothing. Prisoners hadn't gone missing from the black cells, and their new king hadn't performed a single act of magic beyond his unnatural physical capabilities. In a lot of ways, Varys wanted to like Axel Baratheon. If this whole mess with Renly Baratheon could be handled without too much death, then maybe Axel could even be the king that Westeros deserved. But Varys refused to serve a sorcerer. So above all else, he would find out the secret to Axel Baratheon's power. One way or another. XXX. Renly's forces are here and Jon has Axel scared of showing his true nature. Not to worry though everyone, Axel will have a plan for just how he's going to deal with Renly by the end of next chapter. Chapter 20. Solutions. Axel finds the solution to all of his problems in the most unlikely of places. From the mouth of Cersei Lannister. XXX. King's Landing is starving and your father continues to drag his feet. Cersei isn't surprised when Axel comes barging into her quarters with a snarl on his face and hands clenched into fists at his sides. A consequence of becoming intimate with the young king was that there wasn't any real distance between them anymore. There couldn't be if she wanted him to think she was entirely on his side. Of course, her father was making that rather difficult for her, all things considered. It had been over a week now since Renly Baratheon and his army had arrived outside of King's Landing and laid siege to the city. To say that the whole of the city was starving would be something of an overstatement though. Between Lord Aaron's prescient rationing and the unfortunate intervention of one Stannis Baratheon turning the royal fleet towards supplying King's Landing by sea, the city was only just starting to feel the bite at this point. House Redwyne should have been blockading the city, but Renly had rushed to start the siege by land as early as possible and that left the Redwyne fleet trailing behind. Which was quite frustrating for Cersei, because it made it all the harder for her to turn Axel against his other uncle when Stannis was currently doing everything he could to support Axel's hold over the Iron Throne. Still, the Queen Dowager was nothing if not adaptable. Peace, Your Majesty. I've recently received word from my father, the situation isn't as clear-cut as it might seem. Moving over to Axel, Cersei places a calming hand on his arm and with a disarming smile plastered across her face, she guides him over to a nearby chair, gently directing him to sit down. For a moment the king looks mulish, but finally, he sits. It doesn't stop him from glaring up at her though. We've received no word. What could Lord Lannister have to say to you that he couldn't say to his king? Smiling softly, Cersei runs her hands down Axel's front, reaching his crotch. There, she swiftly undoes his breeches and pulls out his cock, wrapping her fingers around his shaft and beginning to stroke it. Axel isn't so easily placated though, barely grunting as he continues to stare her down. I'm afraid it's quite embarrassing for our house. And my father is quite the prideful man. This isn't the kind of thing that he would want anyone outside of House Lannister to find out about, but you deserve to know all the same. Axel narrows his eyes, but in a way that shows he's intrigued, not suspicious. Cersei can tell he's hanging off her every word as she lets out a sigh and shrugs, a calculated motion that causes her barely covered breasts to bounce within the confines of her open gown. My father is dealing with sabotage, Your Majesty. No doubt Renly has sent offers to all the lords of the Westerlands telling them that if they can slow my father down, then he will promote them above House Lannister if he takes the throne. Axel grunts, while Cersei strokes up and down his cock, breathing in slowly for a moment before continuing. This rebellion among my father's vassals is insidious and cloaked in shadow, and it has taken my father all his wits and cunning to find and stamp out the traitors. That is why House Lannister has moved so slowly to gather its forces. But rest assured, once they're finally able to set out, once they arrive, they will be the finest army you could possibly hope for. All lies, of course. Cersei is making it all up on the spot, though if her father knows what's good for him, he'll go along with it if needed when all is said and done. But the truth is, the letter she'd received from Tywin had said nothing about sabotage or traitors. Instead, the letter that had reached her hands and then burned merrily in her fireplace had been quite clear about things. Tywin was doing his best to play both sides, to try and make sure that it was House Lannister and the Westerlands who came out on top no matter who won, just as he'd done during Robert's rebellion over 20 years ago. Her father had also confided in Cersei that Renly had promised no harm would come to her or Myrcella if he did manage to take the city, so by doing nothing and merely feigning loyalty to Axel, her father truly was coming out ahead, like always. Of course, Cersei could read between the lines. This was at least partially punishment for her refusal to take Myrcella and run back before Axel's coronation. Tywin had ordered her to do so, to get them out of harm's way, but Cersei had ignored that order. Now he punished her by making it seem like she couldn't keep her promises. Not to mention Jaime's death, Tywin would never allow Tyrion to inherit, and Cersei knew that her father had long wanted to find a way to extract Jaime from the Kingsguard so he could become heir to Castle Rock once more. Instead, he would now have to rely on her or Myrcella to get him a proper heir that he could set Tyrion aside for. He wanted her scared so that Cersei would come running to him with Myrcella by her side, should the opportunity present itself. No matter. As previously mentioned, Cersei was nothing if not adaptable. And she easily saw through her father's schemes. Of course, she doesn't want Axel to think too hard about what she'd just said regarding sabotage in the Westerlands. Best to distract him before he could spend too much time ruminating over her words. That's why, without any further hesitation, Cersei shucks her gown off, letting it drop to the floor behind her and climbing right into the young king's lap. Surprised but not really caught off guard, Axel's hands immediately go to Cersei's ass, gripping and squeezing her buttocks as she positions herself above his cock. Smiling coyly down at him, the Queen Dowager guides his throbbing member up inside of her and slowly sinks down upon the sizable shaft, moaning heartily all the while. He's as big as ever, his hot, pulsating prick scraping against her insides and stretching out her walls in all the right ways. Cersei shivers in very real delight, even as she tosses her head back in exaggerated ecstasy. There's no denying that Axel is everything Robert should have and could have been to her, at least physically. Back in the day, when she was still young and newly queen, Robert had been handsome enough in her eyes. He was no Rhaegar, but that was fine. Except then it wasn't. Robert turned out to be nothing but a whoremonger and a drunkard, losing himself in other women and the drink practically as soon as they were married. Cersei knew why, of course. He couldn't see past the fact that she wasn't the Stark bitch he was originally betrothed to. It killed any chance of happiness they might have had together in the end. Axel was very different from Robert in that regard. He was neither a drunk nor a whoremonger. He was still a man, meaning that Cersei had not struggled one bit in leading him around by his very large prick, but as far as she was aware, he had yet to take a single other woman to bed aside from her. Given he was still an unmarried king, that sort of restraint was unheard of. If only he wasn't a Baratheon. If only he and she had been born at different times. If only he'd been her first husband instead of Robert. As she bounces up and down on his cock, Axel Baratheon leans forward and takes one of her tits in his mouth, his teeth nibbling down on the nipple in particular. Tossing her head back, Cersei cries out again, even as she clings to his shoulders and gyrates her hips. Yes, Axel was much better than Robert had ever been to her. Not that it would stop her from eventually finding a way to kill him though. This attraction that she developed to the young king was purely physical. She still hated him with all her heart. Him, and his uncles too. Cersei would kill the remaining male members of House Baratheon even if it was the last thing she did. There was a blood debt owed to her for the deaths of her sons and Cersei would see it paid in full. The problem, of course, was how best to make it happen. She had nearly everyone right where she wanted them. Renly Baratheon was at the gates of King's Landing, a traitor trying to wash away the treason he'd committed through the age-old method of winning. After all, so long as you won, it didn't matter how you won. That was a rule as ancient as history was long. Unfortunately, they were on a bit of a time crunch. King's Landing was suffering, but not nearly enough. The small folk down in Flea Bottom were starving, but they were always starving. Time was on Axel's side, even if he didn't really seem capable of accepting or understanding that fact. If Renly couldn't take the city soon, then the forces of the Vale, Riverlands, and North would make it to King's Landing. And as soon as her father heard they were heading south, he would almost certainly pick up the pace as well and pick the winning side, which at that point would likely be Axel's. But if Axel won, Cersei wasn't quite sure how she would convince him to kill Stannis for her on top of Renly. However, if Renly were to win, then the likelihood of Stannis bending the knee to his usurper of a little brother was next to none. Bouncing up and down on Axel's lap, moaning throatily as he sucks at her teats while gripping her ass firmly, Cersei realizes that she needs Renly to win. She needs him to kill Axel for her so that he will also kill Stannis. And then, she can have Renly killed at her leisure. It's an audacious plan perhaps, but it's the best one Cersei has. And while she'll certainly miss Axel's big fat cock and youthful enthusiasm, her need for revenge will accept nothing less than the best plan she can come up with. The question then becomes, how to go about ensuring that Renly wins and takes the city before Axel's allies come south. Finding a way to let Renly's forces into the city seemed the most obvious option, but it came with too many risks, specifically to herself and Myrcella. Sure, Renly had promised her father that he wouldn't let any harm come to them, but Cersei knew all too well what could happen to noblewomen during the chaos of a sacking. Even to princesses and queens. She would not let herself and Myrcella be the next Elia and Rhaenys. No, she needed a way to convince Axel to leave the city and die to Renly outside so that the Lord of Storm's End could be let in without any sort of pitched conflict happening within the city itself. Nice and tidy, that would be for the best. But how? How would she, and then it hits her. Specifically, the orgasm hits her. Cersei cries out, tossing her head back and shuddering as she climaxes all over Axel's cock. Her whimpering moans are muffled by her shoving her face into the crook of his neck, mewling all the while from how sensitive she feels down below, his member still buried inside of her. And then, in that moment, as she's coming down from the buildup of pleasure, the solution to all of her problems actually comes to mind. Gasping, Cersei shoots up, her eyes widening as she looks down at a blinking Axel. She almost starts to smile, but she manages to hide her grin and look somber instead. You're right, my king. The people of King's Landing are starving. And I know a man like you is a man of action. You can't sit easily and just wait Renly out, can you? It's simply not in your blood. Axel grits his teeth and shakes his head. No. Jon keeps saying we'll be fine, that we have enough food between the rationing and the royal fleet's deliveries to last until our allies arrive, but I know that's not entirely true. Those of us here in the Red Keep might be okay, but others in the city are far less fortunate. And it's only going to get worse before it gets better once the Redwyne fleet has arrived on this side of Westeros in full. Smiling now, Cersei gyrates her hips as she runs her fingers along Axel's chiseled jaw. He truly is far too handsome for words. It's almost unfortunate that she's about to trick him into walking a path that will lead right to his own death. What if there was a way for you to end all of this sooner rather than later? What if there was a way to settle this without letting the people of King's Landing starve, a way to handle things without there being any bloodshed, any battles? Or rather, a small amount of bloodshed. A single battle between two very small groups of men. Blinking up at her, Axel furrows his brow. What are you talking about? Cersei finally allows herself a coy, sultry little smile. Have you ever heard of a trial by the seven, my king? Frowning, Axel shakes his head. I can't say I have. Of course not. He'd been raised a bastard after all. Not letting her annoyance show on her face, Cersei keeps smiling. Well, have you heard of trial by combat? That, at least, causes Axel to slowly nod his head. Any noble or knight who has been accused of a crime can demand a trial by combat at any time, where they or their champion will fight another to allow the gods to determine the guilt or innocence of the accused. Hey, he sounds as though he's reciting that from memory. He probably is. Grinning toothily, Cersei drapes her arms over Axel's shoulders and leans in close. Well, your majesty, a trial by the seven is much the same, except it's 7 champions versus 7 champions. It's considerably rarer, but also considerably more sacrosanct, as our ancestors among the Andals believed that such a battle honored the 7 who were won and made them more likely to ensure that those who deserved to win did so. It is often considered to be above even nobility. In fact, some say only those of royal blood can call for a trial by the 7. Licking her lips, Cersei looks right into Axel's eyes. She's heard tales of his martial prowess. He's spent every day since becoming king sparring in the Red Keep's training yard. This, she knew, would appeal to him more than anything. Challenge Renly to a trial by the 7, your grace. If he doesn't accept, his own vassals will begin to think of him as nothing more than a coward. As well, time is on your side, he will agree, because it is the best shot he has for taking King's Landing before the other lords and their armies arrive to put a stop to his warmongering. For a long moment, Axel is quiet and Cersei fears she might have overstepped. Admittedly, she recognizes that she's going out on a limb here. If Axel were wiser to her tricks, he would almost certainly realize she's manipulating him and doesn't have his best interests at heart. You're right. Fortunately, he's quite foolish when it comes to a beautiful woman. Cersei lets out a giggling little yelp when Axel suddenly pulls her off of his cock without even reaching his own release. Before he can stand, she places a hand on his chest and sinks to her knees between his legs. Hold, my king. At least let me take care of this before you go running off to challenge your uncle to a fight to the death. Oral sex is not something Cersei enjoyed doing that much. She preferred to be on the receiving end, rather than giving. But in this case, she's in a good enough mood to take care of Axel with her mouth, leaning forward to wrap her lips around his cock and begin sucking him the rest of the way to his release. She did so love it when a plan came together, after all. Cersei really does think she's the most brilliant woman to ever live. But hey, stopped clocks and all that. Chapter 21. Pitching the trial. Axel summons his small council to hear their advice, but really, he's already made up his mind. XXX. Axel is trying his damnedest to be a better king than his father was, but one way in which he found himself mimicking Robert was the fact that he had no love for small council meetings. As such, he knows it surprises all of them, including Jon, when he calls for such a meeting of his own initiative. Sitting at the head of the table, he waits until everyone is seated before dropping the announcement on the lot of them. I intend to challenge my uncle Renly to a trial by the Seven. I've already brought the idea to the High Septon to make sure that he and the Faith would be on board with such a thing, and he was extremely supportive. However, I will not do anything without at least hearing the advice of my small council first. You have until the end of this meeting to convince me that this is a bad idea. It's heavy-handed and Axel knows it. Especially since everyone in this room probably knows that he barely gives two shits about the opinion of most of the men on his small council. Pycelle was a doddering old fool who should have been replaced ages ago, Baelish was a weaselly penny pincher, and Varys was only as good as the information he rarely seemed to manage to bring to the table. In truth, the only two men Axel actually wants to advise him in this moment are Jon as his hand and Stannis as his master of ships. No doubt the others all recognize this, because they all look between the two men for a moment before settling on the Lord of the Vale and quietly waiting for him to speak first. Silence reigns as a result, because poor Jon Arryn looks absolutely gobsmacked by Axel's declaration. A trial by the Seven, Axel, my king, that would be the height of foolishness. I know it may not look like it, but we have the advantage right now. Despite certain lords dragging their feet, despite the unfortunate geography of the situation, we are nevertheless in a winning position. It would be foolish for us to give that up. The thing is, Axel knows that. Just as he knows Cersei Lannister doesn't have his best intentions at heart. He's not an idiot. Sure, he's weak to a pretty face and weaker still to a beautiful body, but he can tell when he's being manipulated. Jon himself has told Axel that Cersei wasn't trustworthy, and while she has yet to prove to be as much of a snake as the Lord of the Eyrie claimed, he trusts his hand more than he trusts his bedwarmer. However, just because Cersei is manipulating him for some selfish reason Axel doesn't quite comprehend yet does not mean this is a bad idea. Fixing Jon with a look, Axel tries to convey his feelings to the older man. I travel this city every day, as you well know. I journey to the Great Sept of Baelor each morning to pray before the Seven and ask for their guidance. When I leave, I tend to take unconventional routes back to the Red Keep. To let myself see the city as it truly is. Gesturing to the window behind him, through which the whole of King's Landing sprawls into the distance, Axel growls. I've seen the small folk starving in the streets already. If this is what a winning position looks like, I don't want to ever see what it looks like to lose, Jon. His hand grimaces but nevertheless persists. There are over 500,000 people in this city, Your Majesty. There will always be those who are worse off. Starving, even. Especially during a siege. But Lord Stannis has made sure we've continued to retrieve shipments of foodstuffs by sea. Even with the Redwyne fleet finally arriving to start to harrying our ships, we're doing alright. We have enough to survive this siege, at least until our allies can make their way down the King's Road and reinforce the Crownland's army waiting at Hayford Castle. The thing is, Axel can tell that it pains Jon just as much as him. The suffering of the small folk that is. But unlike Axel, his hand has been alive for a long time. He's seen too much, becoming inured to the grief. He's had to weigh the cost of different types of lives against one another one too many times and it's made him jaded. Axel respected Jon's opinion, but he would sooner march out alone and take on Renly's entire army by himself than he would allow the current state of affairs to continue. At least this trial by the Seven offered him the possibility of concealing his true nature a little while longer. We'll survive, Jon. But how many small folk must die just so I can continue hiding behind these walls like a coward? How many babies must wither away, leaving their mothers in despair? How many mothers and fathers must starve, leaving their children orphaned? Silence falls when Jon opens his mouth but can't seem to find the words. After a moment, Axel looks to Stannis next. The Master of Ships has done as much for his reign so far as Jon in Axel's mind. Not only has he stayed loyal where Axel's other uncle turned treacherous, he's also been the city's only source of new food throughout this siege. But the recent arrival of the Redwyne fleet in the Narrow Sea might soon change that, even if Stannis is a proud man and not the type who likes to admit defeat, let alone a disadvantageous situation. So in the end, his response is to be expected. You risk much by offering Renly a way out, Your Majesty. His disapproval evident in his tone, Stannis has a frown on his face as he sits there at the table. Unlike Jon, he doesn't know what Axel is capable of. He doesn't know that this trial would only end one way, in Axel's favor. Still, that ignorance has allowed Axel to think up a way of hopefully placating him. Well, to be fair, all I'd be doing is sacrificing my own claim to the crown. If I lose, then you become the rightful heir to the Iron Throne, not Renly. Even if I have to take the Black, then the Vale, the North, and the Riverlands should still come to your aid and make sure you take your place as king. They will, I'll make sure of it. Jon's words seem to give Stannis some pause, the master of ships looking as surprised as Axel has ever seen him. Even Axel is a little caught off guard by how quickly the older man backs him up. Finally though, Stannis simply inclines his head in acceptance and falls quiet. Looking at the others sitting quietly at the table, Axel waves his hand in an almost dismissive gesture. Speak your minds. Of the other three men, Pycelle speaks up first, talking in his stumbling, stuttering manner. Well, your grace, it would seem to me that you have your heart set on this. And if the High Septon believes it to be a worthy endeavor. Pycelle trails off for a moment, in that way of his. Then, he seems to come back to himself, smiling what he probably thinks is a grandfatherly smile. I am sure the 7 who are one will be less the worthiest side of such a trial. Empty platitudes at best, but then Axel expected nothing less from the ancient Grandmaster. Though he doesn't fail to notice that Pycelle makes no mention of Axel himself being the worthiest of the two sides. Old man is hedging his bets, isn't he? No matter. Axel sweeps his gaze to Varys and Baelish next. Smiling rather smarmily, the master of the coin speaks first. There is much to be said about ending this war as swiftly as possible, your majesty. It seems you've found the best way to go about that. I can find no fault in relying on such an ancient tradition. HMPH. Lord Baelish makes all the proper noises, saying all the right things, and yet, every time Axel hears the other man speak, it sounds less and less sincere. Does he actually believe the things he's saying? Or has he just become a master at saying what he believes others want to hear? Lord Varys, meanwhile, clears his throat. Ahem. The Lord Hand is right, it should be pointed out. Renly Baratheon is already living on borrowed time. We have the supplies to outlast this siege while the armies of the Vale, the Riverlands, and the North make their way down to us. While House Redwyne might start to cut us off at sea, one could argue that they are too little too late. However, there is some question of how things would go from there. Axel raises an eyebrow, gesturing for Varys to continue. The spider does so with a small apologetic smile. Tywin Lannister has sworn fealty to you but takes his time putting action to his words. There is still a possibility that the Lannister armies might join forces with the Reach and the Stormlands when they finally arrive at King's Landing, putting things on a more even footing. 3 kingdoms against 3, and with the more populous, prosperous kingdoms arrayed against us. Grandmaster Pycelle sputters. Preposterous. The Lord of House Lannister would not side against our young king under any circumstances, not after swearing loyalty. What a ridiculous assertion. His small smile remaining on his face, Varys just hums as he looks between Pycelle and Axel. Perhaps not. But it's about the implication, isn't it? Blinking, Axel frowns in confusion. The implication. Nodding, Varys shrugs. Indeed, my young king. If we wait for all the great houses and their armies to finally reach King's Landing, then the most advantageous position will go to Lord Tywin. Rather than having bled his army via protecting against the siege by arriving earlier, he will instead arrive just in time to play kingmaker, as he's done once before. Pycelle lets out another gasp of outrage, but Axel holds up a hand, cutting the Grandmaster off. Truth be told, he found Varys' words more compelling than he would have thought. And now he's irritated, because while he had just been thinking that he wasn't letting Cersei's manipulations get to him, he actually had believed her when she'd said that her father sent a letter speaking of sabotage and treachery in his lands. Was that a bold-faced lie? TCH. Varys just dips his head. To get to my point, your grace, all of this is to say that there is wisdom in ending things before Lord Tywin is allowed such an advantageous position. A trial by the 7 is one such route to doing so, even if waiting for our allies from the north might ultimately be safer. And as you've already pointed out, even if you were to fail, Lord Stannis would still have the most prominent claim to the throne. Perhaps he'd misjudged his master of whispers. Smiling at the bald man now, Axel nods. Thank you, Lord Varys. I have now received all of your counsel. Leave us so that I might speak with my Lord Hand alone for a moment. Pycelle, Baelish, and Varys all look like they each might want to stay a little while longer. But Axel's tone is final and Stannis doesn't hesitate to rise and begin walking out of the room, causing the other three men to stand up and follow after him as well. Soon, it's just Axel and Jon sitting at the table. Looking at his hand, Axel raises an eyebrow. He feels a little guilty for blindsiding Jon with this. But at the same time, do you think he'll lose? Jon flinches at that, inhaling sharply. Because they both know the answer to that question, no. No, Axel will not lose. Not in a trial by the seven. After taking a moment to let out a long, shuddering breath, the older man fixes him with a hard gaze. No, I don't. But do you think you can win without giving too much away? Axel grins. Jon is coming around, he can feel it. Yes, I do. I've been practicing with the knights in the Red Keep's yard every single day since I was crowned king. I've been training myself as much as I've been training them. I've been learning how to hold back just enough to not seem too unnatural. Jon huffs. You've only partially succeeded at that, Axel. Rumors abound about your martial prowess. Perhaps if you wanted not to seem unnatural, you shouldn't have begun regularly trouncing 5 fully armored knights at a time. That, Axel's grin drops, replaced by a frown. He'd needed the challenge, and even then 5 armed men in full armor hadn't been much of one. I'll hold back even further in the trial. 7 versus 7, I'll only double up on my opponents if I absolutely have to, otherwise I'll just take on one at a time and deal with them carefully. Humming for a moment, Jon seems to think before coming to another question. And where will these 6 brave men fighting alongside you come from? The Kingsguard is still vastly depleted. Need I remind you that you have yet to name a single new brother to the order meant to safeguard your life? Axel just rolls his eyes at that. You and I both know I don't need Kingsguard protecting me day and night. I'm more than capable of protecting myself. Still, the trial would be the perfect time to handle some tryouts, would it not? Esser Oakhart and Esser Trant will stay out of things and continue guarding the Queen Dowager and the Princess. Meanwhile, I'll pick 6 of the men I've been sparring with to fight alongside me. If we win, any survivors will be inducted into the Kingsguard. Kills 2 birds with 1 stone. Jon nods, seeming to find no issue with that. Well, almost no issue. If you have no casualties, you'll wind up with 6 new members of the Kingsguard when there are only 5 vacancies. This time, Axel resists the urge to roll his eyes. But he can't help the slightly derisive scoff all the same. Whoever Renly fields couldn't possibly be so bad that all 6 of the knights on my side will survive. Especially if I'm holding back and only going after one of my opponents at a time. Inclining his head to concede the point, Jon grimaces, coming to the final issue at hand. All of this is predicated on your enemy making the utterly foolish decision to accept your challenge in the first place, Axel. Renly Baratheon should be the only one who has an inkling of what you're truly capable of, given those men of his who survived their failed ambush on the King's Road and managed to make it back to the city. He fled on their word. How can you be so sure he'll agree to this? That was an issue, admittedly. But he'll have to agree. Not just because we'll hold out until our allies reach King's Landing if he doesn't. But also because the High Septon will spread word of the sanctity of this would-be trial. If he rejects it, then all will know he's afraid of being judged by the gods themselves. Jon still doesn't look entirely convinced. Sighing, Axel shrugs. Not to mention, if my uncle has any sort of heart whatsoever, he'll recognize that this is the option that ends this stupid war with the least bloodshed. Maybe it's too much for me to hope for, given he's the one who started this insanity in the first place, but all the same, with how fast he's moved, it's clear he was hoping to handle things before it came to open, pitched battle. On the surface, this seems to allow him to avoid that altogether, as well as avoid facing the armies coming for his head. Finally, the Lord of the Vale sighs and nods his head in defeat. Very well. I imagine you wish me to draft up the challenge for you. Perking up, Axel smiles, unable to help but teasing Jon just a little bit. That would be within your duties as my hand, yes. When Jon just gives him a long-suffering look, Axel chuckles. Look, if Renly wins the trial and proves himself more worthy in the eyes of the 7, I'm more than willing to give up the throne and take the black if I survive. And then he'll be facing Stannis and his claim, along with whichever kingdoms back him. But, I think we both know it won't come to that. We both know who's going to win this damn thing. Huffing, it's Jon's turn to roll his eyes, though Axel note that he does so good-naturedly, fighting to hide a smile. Indeed, my very young king. Indeed. XXX. Will Renly do the smart thing and reject the challenge? But then where will he be if he doesn't accept? Chapter 22. Challenge accepted. The challenge comes to Renly Baratheon. XXX. He'll never admit it out loud, of course, but Renly Baratheon isn't really a martially minded person. He finds the thought of hauling himself down to the training yard to spar day after day thoroughly exhausting. Fortunately, as a Lord Paramount, he's never really had to worry too much about that. Oh certainly, there are appearances to be kept up. He knows how to put his armor on and how to hold a sword both in a sheath at his side and in his hands. But beyond that, well, he preferred not to bother. In fact, one might even say he's a bit rusty, but it doesn't matter because you don't need to be the greatest knight in the realm in order to lead an army, or even to lead the realm itself. Still, for all that Renly himself didn't much like crossing swords of the steel variety with his fellow knights, he had to admit that he was a sucker for watching others do it instead. He'd always loved how much Robert enjoyed tournaments, because it allowed him to indulge that favored pastime to his heart's content. Of course, there were no tourneys right now, they were at war after all. However, they were also quite frustratingly in a stalemate at the moment. Renly's forces had put King's Landing under siege, but for now he couldn't take the city. Meaning he was forced to sit on his ass and wait for something to change. Hence sitting on a slightly raised wooden stage with his queen seated to his right and Loras stood to his left as all three of them watched two of his Rainbow Guard, Lady Brienne of Tarth and Esser Parman Crane, duke it out for his pleasure. Renly knew that many, even among his own men, questioned Lady Brienne's appointment. The woman was everything a noblewoman should not be. She was tall, muscular, and altogether homely. Her mouth was too big and her nose crooked from being broken and set more than once. He still remembered the first time he'd met the large woman, all those years ago. Even back then, Brienne had bucked every trend imaginable, and she hadn't remotely comported herself as a noble lady should. This, in turn, had led to no small amount of scorn being heaped on her by her peers, especially when her ugly appearance was combined with her caustic attitude. But what did Renly care what others thought? He was the Lord Paramount of the Stormlands, and she was as much one of his vassals as anyone else. Besides, even at that point Renly had known he was just as different as she was. His affliction and abnormality was merely easier to hide than Brienne's. So yes, he'd treated her with courtesy, and in turn, she'd apparently fallen in love with him. Brienne did not know that Renly knew this, of course. She'd been sent to Storm's End by her father, Lord Selwyn Tarth, with a sealed letter for his eyes only that she had never read. Lord Selwyn's letter had been clear. Renly was the only man who Brienne had ever loved and she would likely never be wed due to not just her appearance, but also her unwillingness to put down her sword and comport herself as a proper noblewoman. The Lord of Tarth had begged Renly to take Brienne into his service as an extra sword, and to treat her with the same respect that he'd treated her the first time they met. Here they were, all these years later, and Renly had to admit, Brienne was probably one of his most loyal, steadfast warriors. She wasn't a knight of course, because women couldn't be knights, but she was still a member of his Rainbow Guard, and she'd more than earned her title, Brienne the Blue, in Renly's eyes. Case in point, the fight in the grass comes to an end as Brienne manages to knock Esser Parman Crane in his ass. Renly makes sure to smile and clap and Marjorie does the same at his side, even as Brienne offers Esser Crane a hand to help him stand. It pleases Renly when the knight actually takes the hand and lets Brienne assist him. Before he can speak up and congratulate both warriors on a hard-fought battle, however, there's a commotion from off to the side that draws his and everyone else's attention. Renly blinks as a good half-dozen of his men escort what looks to be a messenger into the clearing. He leans forward with interest when the messenger is then announced to be from King's Landing. Bowing at the waist, the messenger straightens back up and clears his throat. I bring word from Axel Baratheon, King of the Andals and the First Men, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms, and Protector of the Realm. Loras takes a step forward, no doubt to say or do something inadvisable, but Renly cuts him off with a raised hand that stops him in his tracks and keeps him quiet. Smiling gently, feeling the weight of his crown upon his brow, Renly tilts his head to the side. And what word does my bastard nephew have for me? Is he ready to meet and discuss the terms of his surrender? There's a flash of anger in the messenger's eyes, completely loyal to his nephew then. A shame. No, my lord. The king. A blow to his back from an angry Brienne sends the messenger to his knees. Unfortunately, the Maid of Tarth had been too close and moved too fast for Renly to step in like he had with Loras. You will address his grace as king, not lord. Sighing, Renly shakes his head. Brienne, please. We don't harm messengers. We're better than that. And the man can hardly deliver his message if we're smacking him around. Eyes widening in surprise, Brienne steps back and bows her head in shame. Forgive me, your majesty. I acted without thinking. Renly just smiles and nods. All is forgiven. Right, my friend. The messenger slowly pushes himself back to his feet, eyeing Brienne with narrowed eyes and no small amount of derision. He doesn't bother acknowledging Renly's words either. In the end, he just straightens up and looks back up at the wooden stage. King Axel does wish to meet with you. But he does not intend to surrender, nor does he ask for you to surrender either. He has sent me here today to issue a challenge, Lord Renly. Renly's brow lifts as those in the clearing stir. A challenge, you say? Yes, your lordship. The king challenges you to a trial by the seven. The stir turns onto a full-on rippling as everyone in the area reacts to those words, each in their own way. Plenty of wide eyes, a couple of sharp intakes of breath, and several shifting from foot to foot. Renly himself barely reacts at all outwardly, though inwardly his mind is racing as the messenger continues on, barely hesitating. It is King Axel's most fervent belief that no great amount of blood should be shed for what he calls a pointless war. That is why he offers you this opportunity to have your conflict settled before the gods themselves. Let the seven who are one see justice done. At his side, Loras scoffs under his breath. Renly, of course, does not. But he does share his paramour's sentiment. He's never really cared much for the gods. Obviously, as a southern lord with Andal and Targaryen blood flowing through his veins, he'd been raised on the seven-pointed star and taught the faith from an early age. It just hadn't really stuck. He knew better than to piss off the faith, so of course he paid lip service to the seven, but the idea that they would bless a trial by combat or a trial by the seven to make sure the ones most worthy of winning came out on top was ridiculous to him. No, such things were always won by those with the strongest sword arm. There was no question about that. At his side, Marjorie leans in close to him, whispering in his ear. They're desperate. They must not have enough food stores to last out the siege now that the Redwyne fleet is coming into play. We have them right where we want them. A trial by the seven would only risk everything we've achieved so far. The only one besides him to hear Marjorie's words is her brother. Leaning in from his other side, Loras whispers into Renly's other ear. If you wish to accept, know that I would win the trial for you beyond a shadow of a doubt. With Selmy and Jaime dead, I am the best swordsman on either side of this conflict. No matter who your nephew fields, they don't stand a chance. Marjorie, of course, hears her brother's words and sucks in a sharp breath before scowling mightily and whispering heatedly right back. But what is the point of risking it? For glory. Glory is no use to any of us if you die, Loras. Loras scowls right back, the two siblings basically having a heated discussion right over the top of Renly at this point as everyone else watches but can't quite hear what they're saying. It's not just about glory, Marjorie. If Robert's bastard has sent this challenge, it means he's probably consulted the High Septon at this point. And if the High Septon has signed off on it, then all of King's Landing will have heard about it. From there, news will travel throughout the entirety of Westeros. Everyone will call our king a coward if he turns down a trial by the seven that has the faith's backing. Now that was a fair point. Cutting Marjorie off from responding with a raised hand that causes both of the Tyrell siblings to pull back into their previous positions, Renly looks down to the waiting messenger. Why worry about what ifs, when they can just ask directly? Tell me, what does the High Septon say of this challenge? We are, all of us, devout adherents to the faith after all. Grinning, the messenger juts out his chin as he responds. The High Septon's been preaching that it's a blessed idea, your lordship. He says it's the best way to end this with the least amount of bloodshed and that the seven will surely look down favorably on whichever side wins it. And just like that, Renly is trapped. It's a beautiful maneuver on the part of his nephew, he has to admit. Either he rejects the challenge and further ruins his already somewhat tarnished reputation in the eyes of the Seven Kingdoms' great houses, or he accepts and gives Axel a chance to end this war without having to wait for the rest of his forces to arrive. But then to be fair, this is also a boon for Renly, in a way. What Marjorie doesn't know because she hasn't been told is that Renly's latest scouts report his brother Stannis used the royal fleet to sail multiple shipments of food into King's Landing's harbor before the Redwyne fleet could arrive. From all up and down the narrow sea, Stannis had brought in supplies to keep King's Landing safe. Now, even a fleet of ships aren't enough to feed the entire population of King's Landing forever, especially with House Redwyne finally making it to the party, but they might allow Axel to hold out until the Vale, Riverlands, and North are finally able to make their way down south. At which point, Tywin Lannister might choose to stop dragging his feet and come join the winning side, which would no longer be Renly's. In a way, Renly appreciated this offer because it took the power away from the great houses and put it squarely in the hands of him and his nephew. Only one side would emerge victorious, and the other would be forced to concede because to do otherwise would be tantamount to blasphemy in the eyes of the faith. And while Loras could be a bit boastful at times, Renly was inclined to believe that his Knight of Flowers was correct in his assessment of the relative skill level between their two sides. With Barristan Selmy and Jaime Lannister both dead, Loras truly was the best knight left in the region, if not the best knight in all of the Seven Kingdoms. Not to mention the last Renly had heard, Axel hadn't even refilled his King's Guard yet. Meanwhile, Renly fully believed that his Rainbow Guard was made up of the best 7 warriors in his entire army. With all of that in mind, I accept. Loras grins a vicious grin while Marjorie slumps a little in her seat. Leaning forward, Renly laces his fingers together as he gives the messenger a smile. Return to my bastard nephew and let him know I agree to his challenge. If the High Septon himself believes that a trial by the 7 is the most blessed way to end this conflict, then who am I to refuse? Let it be known that I, Renly Baratheon, rightful king of the 7 kingdoms, will humbly accept whatever outcome the gods deem most just. The messenger bows and backs away. Renly watches him go, knowing that the actual details such as day and time will have to be hashed out through either letters or more messengers over the next few days. But one way or another, this is happening now. It's been set in motion and can't be taken back anymore. As soon as the messenger is out of sight, Loras places a hand on Renly's shoulder. I won't let you down, my king. Placing his own hand atop Loras, Renly smiles up at him and nods. I know you won't, Loras. From his other side, Marjorie lets out a disgruntled, unladylike noise. Please just tell me that you won't be so foolish as to fight in the trial yourself. Letting out a laugh, Renly shakes his head. Of course not, my queen. Why would I when I have 7 of the greatest warriors that the 7 kingdoms have ever produced right here in front of me? Every member of his Rainbow Guard hears his boisterous words, just as intended. All of them straighten up, square their shoulders, and preen a little at his praise. Brienne in particular looks absolutely gobsmacked before a beaming smile spreads across her face, only matched by the one she'd had the first time they met. Renly meets her eyes and the eyes of each member of his Rainbow Guard, smiling and nodding at them individually to show his faith in every single one of them. It would hopefully help to quiet the discontentment among the Storm Lords when they themselves heard that he wasn't taking part. Renly knew his vassals well, and while he had carefully cultivated their affection all his life, he also knew some of them would think him craven for not fighting in the trial himself. But if he framed it as him refusing to sideline any of his noble Rainbow Guard, then they might be willing to accept it. No, they would accept it, especially when the Rainbow Guard won the day in the trial and showed themselves all to be some of the best warriors that the 7 kingdoms had to offer. Of course, he wasn't just going to be relying on their skill at arms to carry this trial by the 7. No, even as he settles back into his chair and gestures for another sparring match to begin, Renly's mind drifts to a letter back in his tent. It's a letter he'd received over a week ago now, one he had honestly thought to ignore. But now that the entire war will be decided on one battle between 7 of his champions and 7 of Axel's, Renly can't help but think about it. Is he really going to do it? Can he truly afford the cost of such a thing? But then again, can he afford the cost if he doesn't take the offer and his champions lose? If Loras died in this upcoming trial, Renly would never forgive himself. No, he had to do whatever it took to make sure Loras came out on top. XXX. And so the trial is confirmed and Renly is scheming to make sure his side wins. But what does he have in mind? And what's this about a letter? Chapter 23. Small Council Perspectives Redux. A multi-paw showing the true feelings of Axel's small council to the news of a trial by the 7. XXX. With Renly agreeing to the challenge, a date for the trial by the 7 is pinned down in just a few more messages, and like that, it's confirmed. Truthfully, Jon doesn't know how to feel about it. Part of him can't help but wonder where Axel got the idea in the first place. Had the most devout whispered it in the young king's ear during one of his daily visits to the Great Sept? Or was it someone else with even worse intentions than the High Septon? Frankly, the Lord of the Vale doesn't know whether to be relieved or worried now. At this point Renly has already lost, he just doesn't know it yet. By agreeing to let things be decided by a trial by the 7, Renly has effectively forfeited his claim to the Iron Throne. After all, it's not like Axel is going to lose. Jon still remembers in vivid detail what Robert's son had done to those treacherous Baratheon knights that day on the King's Road. He'd barely seemed human with how fast he'd moved and how strong he'd been. Cutting men in half with his sword, punching jaws clean off with his fist. None of their enemies had been safe that day. Only those who had fled the moment they realized the tide was turning had survived, and Jon suspected if Axel hadn't had to look after him, they too would have been run down and killed. He'd seen how swift the younger man was after all. Jon didn't doubt that Axel could have run down even the fastest horse in Westeros. But that brought up the issue of what came next. Renly would lose and either surrender to take the Black or be executed for his traitorous actions. That part was all but set in stone now, with the only thing left to choose being the men Axel would fight with on the day. But that was Axel's choice, not Jon's. More than a dozen knights staying in the Red Keep had been helping Axel hone his skills with a sword ever since his coronation. All of them had volunteered to participate in the trial by the Seven once it was announced. Even after Axel had told them he would be naming the survivors of the trial to the Kingsguard, no one had retracted their offer. To be fair, being a member of the Kingsguard was one of the greatest honors a knight could strive for, regardless of how restrictive their vows were. As well, much like Robert before him, Axel was capable of inspiring great loyalty in people. His stature, his strength of arms, and his personality had led to the men he'd been training with all wanting to follow him to the ends of the earth and back. The young king would know who the best of those knights were, so Jon left it up to him to decide who would stand by his side the day of the trial. Jon himself was far more concerned with what would happen afterwards. For instance, there was House Tyrell to be considered. Renly would either die or take the Black, but as frustrating as it was, Jon would not be advising Axel to remove House Tyrell from their seat in the Reach. It wasn't like there was anyone else in the Reach who had stayed loyal to elevate to their position, to be fair. The Reach lords had sided with their Lord Paramount to a man, leaving them with little options. However, Margaery Tyrell had apparently traveled with Renly on this war for some reason, so once the trial was won, they would at least have her as a hostage. Jon would suggest that Axel keep Margaery in King's Landing for a time, to make sure that her family stayed in line. On top of that, the Reach would almost certainly be forced to pay reparations for a good long while for this. At least a decade, perhaps more if Axel was feeling particularly vengeful. That might even be able to help them start working on the crown's debt too. Frankly, Jon wished that they could do the same with House Lannister, especially since so much of the debt was owed to the Lions of Castle Rock. Unfortunately, Tywin had threaded the needle and remained just shy of being blatantly disloyal. If nothing else, that was another thing Jon liked about this trial by the Seven. It took all the power out of the hands of opportunistic men like Tywin Lannister and put it back where it belonged, in Axel's hands. But speaking of Axel's hands, well, Jon couldn't truly prepare yet for that part. They would have to wait and see just how much of his true nature Axel had to expose in the trial before Jon would know what damage control he needed to run. Fortunately, the faith was still on their side for now, and the somewhat open secret of Renly's preferences should keep the faith and the most devout on their side once Axel won. Still, it was only going to be as clean as Jon made it. So even though the war was pretty much already over, the work was only just beginning. At least Jon could rest easy knowing that Renly had seemingly ignored the tales from those survivors on the King's Road and had absolutely no idea what the fuck he'd just agreed to. XXX. Stannis Baratheon knew what people thought of him. He knew that he was not a well-liked man. A combination of being a hard man with a strong sense of pride had led him to run afoul of many people over the length of his life. That, together with what he believed to be a completely reasonable sense of duty and justice, made him a pariah among the nobility of Westeros. No more so than with his late brother, Robert II. Stannis had done everything that was asked of him and more. During the rebellion, he'd successfully held Storm's End against Mace Tyrell's siege, even as he and his men had starved. Following the sack of King's Landing, he'd built a royal fleet at Robert's behest to seize the island of Dragonstone, the last stronghold in the possession of House Targaryen. Through events outside of his own control, the Mad King's last remaining children had escaped Dragonstone even as Stannis had taken the island castle. But even though it wasn't his fault, Robert had blamed him all the same. He'd gone on to name him Lord of Dragonstone, while Renly had been given Storm's End. To make matters worse, Renly had been made Lord Paramount of the whole of the Stormlands, a position that should have been Stannis, by birthright. Even still, Stannis toiled at Robert's behest all these years. Decades of service as his brother's master of ships. Not a single ounce of appreciation in return. Unlike Renly, since Stannis was away from the city at the time, News Robert's death had come with the news of his bastard's legitimization. Truth be told, it hadn't surprised him, not really. One last knife in the eye before his older brother finally met the stranger. If anyone had a right to be angry about being supplanted, it was Stannis. With Joffrey and Tommen dead, Stannis should have been Robert's heir. Sure, Myrcella technically had a claim as princess, but the lords of Westeros would never abide by a queen upon the Iron Throne, and Stannis doubted that even Tywin Lannister would have tried for such a thing. Not that it had wound up mattering in the end. Instead, his fat oaf of a brother had made sure with his dying breath that Stannis would never sit on the Iron Throne. Funny then that his legitimized bastard, Stannis' new king, was giving him a chance at the throne anyways. If Axel Baratheon lost the trial by the Seven, then Stannis fully intended to push his claim. He certainly wouldn't let Renly have the city or the throne while he still drew breath. But even if Axel won, Stannis didn't think he would mind, much to his own surprise. His nephew had shown more gratitude and affection towards Stannis in the short time since he'd arrived in King's Landing than Robert had all of his life. And sure, part of that was because the royal fleet was bringing in food that was keeping the city going through the siege. But even still, Axel seemed to truly appreciate that Stannis was loyal where Renly was not. It was his duty, in the end. He would serve his new king just as he'd served the last, regardless of his own personal feelings in the matter. And if Axel should fall, then it was also Stannis' duty to make sure that his traitorous little brother never got the chance to sit on the Iron Throne. Duty and justice. These were principles that Stannis had lived by all his life, no matter how difficult it was at times. But he had to admit, recently, it had been far easier. XXX. At the small council meeting, Petter had of course said what he felt needed to be said, but his true feelings were a different story altogether. A trial by the Seven was the last thing Petter needed to happen at this point in time, and now that a date had been set and the trial confirmed, Petter was left scrambling against the sands of the hourglass he'd just been saddled with. Even though the Master of Coin would have preferred more of an actual war and a whole lot more bloodshed, the siege had been extremely lucrative for his side businesses all the same. Specifically, Stannis turning the royal fleet towards supplying King's Landing from the water had given Petter a rather massive opportunity. Every single ship in the royal fleet that was currently transporting foodstuffs from other ports over to King's Landing was one less ship that was patrolling the narrow sea looking for pirates, smugglers, and other clandestine sailors who might be on his payroll. In fact, a few of those ships from the royal fleet were now on his payroll as well, though their captains didn't really know it. With some coin in the right hands and a few words in the right ears, it wasn't always just food that the ships were transporting into King's Landing. Nor did they always leave with cargo holds that matched their documentation either. However, just when Petter felt like he was really starting to gain momentum, it was all going to have to come to a crashing halt. If only the siege had lasted a little longer, or even graduated into a full-blown war outside of the city once the armies from the Vale, Riverlands, and North arrived. If that had happened, then Petter could have continued making golden dragons hand over fist. But no. No, one way or another, the show was over and Petter would be damned if he would be the one left holding the bag. It would probably require burning a few of his smuggler contacts in the process, especially with the speed that he had to move to get it all done in a timely manner, but that was just how the game went sometimes. As soon as the trial was over and a victor was decided, things would start to go back to normal. And that would mean a lot more scrutiny of just about everything. Bribes would still work, but they would almost certainly go up in price and not be as effective as they were before. And ultimately, Petter wasn't willing to risk any of it. No matter who won, he needed to be ready to take advantage of what came next. There was, of course, some difference in the two outcomes. If Renly won, Petter wasn't sure whether he would manage to keep his position or not. He was technically Lord Arryn's appointment, after all. At the same time though, if he could manage to stay on as Master of Coin, then the new hand of the king would be Mace Tyrell and that utter buffoon would be perfect for Petter's purposes. On the other hand, if Axel won, then while Petter was confident he would remain Master of Coin, things would be much less perfect. In that scenario, he would have to tread carefully once Jon's focus was no longer caught up in a starving city and an army on their doorstep. There were benefits and costs to both outcomes. And either way, there would be opportunities for Petter to weigh when the time came. He just had to be ready for them, and make sure that he was playing the game to the fullest of his abilities. One way or another, Petter Baelish would weather the coming storm, no matter what form that storm took. XXX. Varys had to admit, this trial by the Seven was precisely what he wanted. Oh sure, he'd been careful to give a somewhat neutral response in the small council meeting, but the instant he'd heard the words from their young king's mouth, the Master of Whispers had been absolutely elated. Not only would this limit the bloodshed drastically, but it would also give Varys a chance to see Axel Baratheon in a live combat situation. With men actually trying to kill him, the young king would no longer be able to hold back quite so much, Varys hoped. After all, having watched Axel spar each day, he's noticed several oddities about the young man that others seem to be ignoring. Such as the fact that Axel has never received a single injury in the yard. He's never been winded, nor knocked down. Not even once. Now on the face of it, one might assume that part of this was because of Axel's position. He was the king of the Seven Kingdoms after all. That, combined with his powerful physique and youth, made him not just a formidable opponent to fight, but also a dangerous one. Nobody wanted to be the knight who put their king on his ass. Nobody wanted to be the knight who drew blood from their new king so soon after the last king had died. However, that wasn't what was happening. Oh sure, initially some of the knights that Axel had sparred with had very clearly held back. But just as Varys had noticed, so had Axel. And he'd quickly disabused them of their belief that they couldn't go full strength with him. No, instead, over the weeks, Axel Baratheon had begun pushing the men he fought harder and harder, dragging them up with him as he steadily learned from them, and taught them some things in turn. Varys wasn't much of a fighter, but even he had to admit that there was something inspiring about watching the young king do battle. Like poetry in motion, really. However, was it poetry in motion, or sorcery in motion? Because Varys hadn't just noticed that Axel was never injured, winded, or knocked down. He also noticed that the young man never seemed to even break a sweat. Oh, he made an effort of pretending to, of course. Wiping his brow when necessary, even pretending to pant from time to time. But Varys, little birds were often able to get a hold of Axel's clothes after a long sparring session once he'd stripped them off in order to take a bath. Those clothes told the true story. They weren't soaked through even a little bit. Either Axel Baratheon didn't perspire at all, or he simply hadn't encountered a tough enough fight to push him to that limit yet. So yes, Varys was very interested in seeing Axel in the upcoming trial by the Seven. Especially since the correspondence between the two Baratheon kings had allowed him to slip a few of his little birds into Renly's camp, and deeper still, into Renly's tent. Varys had received copies of all of Renly's correspondence, and was kept up to date on what sort of letters the man was sending out. One of those letters was quite intriguing. Not just the contents, but the recipient as well. It would seem that Renly Baratheon was intent on arming his paramour and Lord Commander with a secret weapon. Loras Tyrell was already bound to be one of the stronger combatants in this upcoming trial by the Seven. It would be quite interesting to see just how he might fare against Axel Baratheon, especially when armed with Valyrian steel. Chapter 24. Great Sept and Cersei. A.N. Axel visits the Great Sept to see one of his favorite women, before going and visiting his other favorite woman. XXX. Axel finds that he most prefers to visit the Great Sept of Baelor in the mornings, just as the sun is rising over the city. If he goes any later in the day, then he risks displacing other worshippers with his mere presence, since of course as king he absolutely needs to have the main chamber of the Great Sept all to himself for some reason. He had tried and failed to convince the High Septon that this wasn't necessary, and that he didn't really want anyone to inconvenience themselves on his behalf. But the leader of the faith had in turn explained to him that nobody was even under orders to clear out when he appeared. Instead, they were doing so of their own accord out of respect for both their pious king and the Seven who are one. Axel wasn't sure if he believed the somewhat corpulent man, but outside of starting to interrogate everyone who fled the moment he showed up, he didn't really have a way of finding out for certain. And of course, if he went even later still, after the day was over, then while the Great Sept might be emptied out, it also became a little disturbing. Dark, really. Oh sure, it was still lit by plenty of candles scattered all over the place, but it felt somewhat eerie, if Axel was being honest. Not that he was afraid of ghosts or anything like that. Or maybe he was. Specters were the one thing Axel couldn't just punch to death, after all. Regardless, coming in the morning not only ensured that he would both be largely undisturbed while at the same time not be a disturbance himself, it also had the benefit of giving him the best lighting. With the rising sun coming through the upper balcony of the Great Sept's main chamber, the whole place was awash in that beautiful morning light. It really was wonderful. Moving from statue to statue, Axel prays in front of each of them, as is his usual preference. He always starts with the smith, a statue of a man holding a blacksmith's hammer. Tall and proud with a strong back and a bald head, he represents ingenuity and craftsmanship. Axel then skips the stranger, as is tradition. Of the seven, the stranger is not meant to be worshipped, which is why his statue faces away from the center of the room and over towards the wall. After the smith, he goes to the crone, a visage of an old woman holding a lantern. From her, he comes to the warrior, an armored knight holding swords crossed over his chest. From the warrior, he comes to the mother, her dress tantalizingly revealing and her arms held open, her hands empty. The mother is then followed by the father, who holds the scales of justice aloft as he towers over Axel just like the others. Finally, last but certainly not least, is the maiden. Axel moves in front of her statue and stares up at her in wordless silence for a time, pretending to pray as he enjoys the view. Technically, there are better routes for particularly pious individuals to take across the 6 inward-facing statues of the 7. In most of the time, visitors to the Great Sept don't even bother praying at each statue, preferring to focus their time on 1 or 2 of the 7 that they most need guidance from on that day. As a young king who needs to be seen as particularly pious, Axel doesn't have that sort of privilege. And so, every single day, he comes to the Great Sept and starts his route with the smith, because if he starts with the smith and works his way around the circle, spending several minutes gazing up on the visage of each of the statues, then it's not particularly strange if he spends an extra few moments staring up at the maiden. The maiden is Axel's treat, one might say. Because the maiden's statue within the Great Sept of Baelor depicts her as completely in the nude. She's quite shapely too, with full breasts and curvy hips and a tight cleft right between her thighs. Truly, whoever sculpted her was a visionary of a man. Yes, the maiden is definitely not the least of the Great Sept statues, and she always leaves Axel feeling a certain sort of way as he ends his circuit of the Great Sept and leaves to head back to the keep. A certain sort of way that he carries with him for a time, until he can get things taken care of. XXX. Plap. 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 F fuck. Yes. H harder. Fuck me harder. Hands on her shoulders, squeezing down but not so hard that he bruises her flesh, Axel slams his cock into Cersei Lannister from behind time and time again. The Queen Dowager is no maiden, yet her body, even after giving birth 3 times, could certainly give the Great Sept statue of the maiden a run for its money. His hips crash into her ass as he plows her from behind, his prick pistoning in and out of her gushing wet cunt with seemingly reckless abandon. Obviously, he doesn't go hard enough to harm her. If he used his true strength, Axel isn't sure there's a woman alive who could survive him. Certainly not Cersei. So instead he holds back a considerable amount, even as he lets her think that she's getting everything she can out of him. The Queen Dowager certainly seems to like it rough during these experiences, always egging him on, always goading him further. Pull my hair. Smack my ass. Or are you not man enough to do what Yorga? Smack. Like that. Sometimes Cersei tried to bring Robert up, just to piss Axel off. He's gotten good at interrupting her though, laying a palm strike across her ass that makes her choke on her own spit. Of course, to make sure she doesn't try again, he then reaches for her hair, gathering it into a fistful and pulling her head back roughly. Cersei groans and moans in equal measure as Axel redoubles his pace, driving in and out of her cunt with powerful thrusts. Her pussy walls try and fail to squeeze the life out of his pulsating prick, even as she comes for him, time and time again. Finally though, he can feel himself getting close. However, their relationship has evolved since their initial encounters. Oh, he still doesn't come inside of her. But these days, he also doesn't come in the nearest rag he can find either. Here it comes. As he warns her, Axel pulls out of her cunt and uses his grip on her hair to help bring her around. Cersei doesn't resist him, the Queen Dowager spinning on her hands and knees until she's facing his rock-hard cock. Staring up into Axel's eyes, Cersei takes him in her mouth, sucking in her cheeks and swirling her tongue along the head of his shaft. With a heartfelt groan, he tips over the edge and delivers his load into the Lannister woman's waiting maw. She swallows greedily, drinking down his seed like there's no tomorrow. She's an excellent cocksucker, though most of the time he can tell that she prefers he just fuck her. However, ever since the first time she dropped to her knees for him, she's at least taken to having him do this at the end of each and every one of their encounters. His balls empty down the Queen Dowager's throat, preventing the possibility of any unwanted accidents as she guzzles his cum like a flea-bottom whore. Finally though, it's done and Axel releases his grip on her hair. Watching her pull away for a moment, he eventually drops down onto the bed, laying on his back. Cersei joins him of course, curling up beside him and pressing her bosom into his chest. Her breasts might sag a bit more than those of the maiden's statue, but to be fair, one is marble and the other is flesh. And despite Cersei's age, her tits have held up extremely well, maintaining their heft and size quite admirably. He certainly finds himself enjoying the way they feel pressed against his bared skin, even as Cersei leans in close, her lips tracing a handful of kisses along his jawline for a moment before she finally speaks. The trial by the seven fast approaches. Do you think you're ready, Your Grace? Axel resists the urge to derisively snort, instead smirking a little bit as he wraps an arm around the Queen Dowager. Worried for me. It was your idea, you know. Cersei rolls her eyes at that, lightly slapping his chest. I merely wish to make sure that your head is in the right place. You know you cannot show the traitor any mercy, right? If you leave Renly Baratheon alive, he will only find a way to weasel out of things and come back later to continue being a thorn in your side. Axel keeps his face carefully composed, hiding the frown that wants to stretch across his features. It was always the same thing with Cersei. They fucked and then she tried to whisper honeyed words into his ear. Once in a while she had excellent ideas, such as the trial by the seven. But most of the time, she seemed oddly focused on making sure he killed his uncle. Or rather, his uncles. And Stannis, he's only biding his time, Axel. You can't let your guard down, not with either of them. They want your throne, and they will stop at nothing to get it. Now Axel does frown, because while he has absolutely nothing good to say about Renly Baratheon, he can't help but want to defend Stannis' honor. I'm not sure you're right about Stannis. Everyone else says he doesn't have a single subtle bone in his entire body, and that he's lawful to a fault. Frankly, having spoken to the man myself several times now, it sounds like he should have been Master of Laws instead of Renly all along. In fact, there's a reason the Master of Laws position has remained vacant all this time. For his loyal and leal service, Axel intends to make Stannis both Lord Paramount of the Stormlands and Master of Laws once this is all over. He also plans to let the man choose his own replacement as Master of Ships, because Stannis should know better than them who the best of his subordinates are. Axel has already discussed this idea with Jon and his hand has agreed that it sounds wise. Sure, Stannis might not be well liked by the lords of Westeros, but he'd performed admirably in this war that wasn't a war. His loyalty, along with the way he turned the royal fleet towards shipping in food to King's Landing, had saved countless lives and deserved recognition and reward alike. Of course, they're not planning to tell Stannis any of this until after the trial is won. And Axel's certainly not about to tell Cersei either. Especially since even his lukewarm defense of the man provokes her into pulling away from his arms with a huff. Be careful not to be blinded by fools and sycophants, my very young king. They will all tell you what you want to hear, and make sure to reinforce what you want to believe. Someone like me who has nothing left to prove or aim for will tell you the truth. Keep that in mind. Axel makes a face behind Cersei's back as she turns away from him, climbing off the bed. Really, did she think he didn't see through her? Sure, maybe the Queen Dowager didn't have anything left to prove, but it was obvious she still had things she wanted. Her hatred for his uncles was especially clear, even if Axel didn't fully understand it. Still, she couldn't think that he would just execute Stannis on nothing but her suspicions, could she? You should prepare yourself for Renly to not take direct part in the trial by the seven as well. Wait, what? That catches Axel off guard and makes him sit up, his brow furrowing in confusion. What do you mean? Of course he'll take part, his honor is on the line. Cersei just scoffs, giving him a disappointed look. You think after everything that he's done, Renly Baratheon cares about his honor? The man is a sword swallower who, despite having never had any thoughts of being in line for the Iron Throne, clearly started plotting to take it for himself even before Robert was fully dead. More than that, he is soft and a coward. He won't fight because the trial does not demand it of him. He'll have this, Rainbow Guard, of his fight in his stead, the seven of them against you and whoever you pick. That, once again Axel is reminded that not everything Cersei says is completely brainless. Certainly, it's almost all venomous, but she has some good ideas. And the more he thinks about it, the more Axel thinks that Cersei might be right. Of course, she's not done explaining exactly what she believes will happen tomorrow. When all is said and done, once you've won, Renly will either try to find a way to declare the trial a farce and continue pushing for the Iron Throne, or he will surrender and offer to take the black in exchange for his miserable life. You must gird yourself for either outcome, Axel. And no matter what, you must take his head. You cannot allow him to escape your clutches or he will only come back later, as I said before. Right. One tidbit of useful information. followed by more insistence that he absolutely needs to make sure his uncles die by his hand. That was Cersei to the hilt, wasn't it? Truthfully, if it were in the trial itself, Axel wouldn't mind killing Renly in one-on-one combat for the headache that the other man has given him with all this nonsense. But afterwards, if Renly does surrender, if he does swear to take the black, Axel would allow it. To do otherwise would be too close to kinslaying for his taste. His silence is telling apparently, because after a long moment Cersei just scoffs. It feels like nothing I say seems to get through that thick head of yours. If you're not going to listen, you might as well leave. You've already had your fill of me, clearly. Well, she's not wrong. In the end, Axel wordlessly gets up and gets dressed, leaving Cersei's chambers with one final lingering glance in the Queen Dowager's direction. On the one hand, he's grateful for the warning she's given him. Much like suggesting the trial in the first place, he's pleased now that he can prepare himself for the likelihood of his uncle's cowardice. This way he won't be too surprised, nor will he make a fool of himself if Renly truly doesn't participate in the trial on the day. But on the other hand, Axel was beginning to think the deaths of the Queen Dowager's loved ones had done more damage to her mind than he'd previously suspected. Her sons, her husband, her brother. Too many deaths too close together had left her spiteful and lashing out. Axel didn't know what to do about it, but now wasn't the time anyways. He had a trial to win, after all. And with that victory, this entire damn war would finally come to an end. Hopefully ruling the peace would be easier. XXX. Axel continues to have Cersei's number. Poor Cersei, she just wants him to murder his uncles for her. Is that really so much to ask in exchange for copious amounts of MILF pussy? Chapter 25. Valyrian Steel. The day before the trial, Renly has a gift for Loras while Margaery watches on. XXX. Are you truly not even a little bit worried? Loras looks over at her from where he's making sure his gear is ready, preparing both his armor and weapon for the trial by the 7 happening tomorrow at midday. Should I be? We already know from our spies just who the bastard intends to bring with him to the trial. None of them are a match for me. Sure, I doubt we'll win without casualties, but I don't think for a second that they have a chance of victory. Margaery wasn't so sure. In fact, she was more than a little afraid for her brother, especially since she'd been doing some digging of her own ever since Renly accepted the challenge. What about Axel himself though? Furrowing his brow, Loras sets down his breastplate and gives Margaery his full attention. Have you been chasing rumors, sister? Flushing just a tad, Margaery huffs and rolls her eyes in response. I've simply been doing my own research, brother. With a scoff, Loras waves a hand dismissively as he returns to his work. I'm sure you've heard the same thing that everyone else has. That the bastard's prowess in the training yard is second to none and he's been tearing through his sparring partners at an insane rate. They even say he routinely has 3 to 5 knights challenge him, only to beat them all without suffering a single scratch. Loras turns and spits on the ground, making it clear what he thinks of all of that. It's a bit of a crude thing for the Knight of Flowers to do, but they're alone right now and for all that her brother is a very beautiful man, he can be a bit crasser than most think of him as. Hogwash, all of it. They're letting him win, Margaery. There isn't a man alive who can take on 5 fully armored knights and come out the victor without at least taking a few bruises here and there. It's all part of the myth that Jon Arryn is trying to build around his puppet, see. Don't let yourself fall for it. But Margaery isn't convinced. That's all well and good, but what about the reports from our own men? Loras furrows his brow in confusion. What are you talking about? Really? Was he just playing dumb or, no, he wasn't playing dumb. He'd probably just completely forgotten about it. Typical of her brother. His head could be so empty sometimes. Huffing, Margaery throws her hands into the air. The survivors from the ambush on the Kingsroad, Loras. Did you think I wouldn't find out? Did you think grandmother wouldn't hear about it and warn me? Her brother's face goes pale and he opens and closes his mouth for a moment before hissing and shaking his head. Don't talk about that, Margaery. And honestly, those men were craven, nothing that came from their lips can be trusted. She wasn't so sure about that. They're the only ones on our side who have seen Robert's bastard fight for real though, Loras. They had twice the numbers and still lost somehow. Doesn't that lend some credence to their words? Sure, it's hard to believe that he moved like a demon and slaughtered half of them faster than they could blink, but it's equally hard to believe they lost with such an overwhelming advantage. Loras rolls his eyes and fully turns to her, placing his hands on his knees as he looks her straight on. Sister, you will never understand battle the way I do. You're simply not built for it. Those knights, it's obvious that they gave the game away somehow. For instance, perhaps Sir Kai considered the idea of an ambush dishonorable, so he initiated a disastrous charge the moment that they came into sight of Lord Arryn and his forces. Whatever tactics they employed were clearly such a failure that they felt the need to make up a fanciful story about one man managing to turn the tide and force them into retreat. Sneering, the Knight of Flowers grits his teeth. Frankly, they're lucky that Renly showed them any mercy at all after their failure. The only reason I didn't counsel him to take each and every one of their heads was because their cowardice is the only reason he was able to escape King's Landing unscathed. Shaking his head, Loras' tone gains a distinct note of finality. Their words, beyond the part where they confessed that they failed, were nothing but gibbering panic nonsense. Neither Renly nor I have given them any weight, and you shouldn't either, dear sister. Axel Stone is only a man, and after tomorrow, he'll either be a dead man or bound for the wall. There is no other possibility. Well said, Loras. Well said. Marjorie flinches and Loras straightens up as Renly suddenly steps into the tent, a jovial smile on his face. She definitely hadn't intended to voice her concerns anywhere where Renly could hear them, despite technically being his queen. But admittedly, Loras would probably have just told him anyways over pillow talk later on. Looking between the two of them, Renly just grins. Not to worry. I share your concerns about the battle tomorrow, my queen. Blinking in surprise, Marjorie sits up a little straighter. Why you do? Nodding, Renly lifts up what he's brought with him, a long package that even Marjorie can tell is clearly a sword wrapped in cloth. Indeed. That's why I come bearing gifts. Something that will make sure the tides of battle tomorrow turn decisively in our favor. For you, my loyal Lord Commander. Loras flushes as Renly gives him a wide grin and a wink, striding over and holding out the package across his palms. Rising to his feet, Loras steps forward and takes the wrapped sword from Renly, furrowing his brow in curiosity and intrigue. Renly steps back as Loras begins to unwrap the thing, quickly doing away with the cloth and rope to reveal that it is indeed a sheathed sword. A beautiful, sheathed sword by Marjorie's estimation. The pommel is unadorned but nevertheless gorgeously crafted, and the sheath has stags running through flowery meadows all along its length. Unfortunately, I couldn't get the pommel itself finished before tomorrow, but the sheath is a rush order. I hope you like it. I love it. It's beautiful, Renly. Marjorie watches Renly grin as he in turn watches Loras look over the sheath, running his fingers along the designs covering the leather. And what do you think of the blade itself? Humming, Loras carefully pulls the sword a few inches free of the sheath, only to freeze in place, his eyes widening and his jaw dropping open in disbelief. Marjorie furrows her brow at that reaction, craning her neck to see what he's reacting to. Interestingly, the sword itself looks strange. It's hard to tell from where she's sitting, but she thinks she sees rippling patterns in the metal. What did that mean? Renly, this is Valyrian steel, yes. Only the best for my Lord Commander. Wait, what? Now it's Marjorie's turn to be shocked, her jaw dropping open as she jumps from her seat and all but rushes over to see the sword Loras is holding more closely. Her brother pulls back at her approach. Whoa there, sister. This isn't the kind of sword to pull out too close to a lady. I'm going to have to ask you to step back so I can fully unsheathe this beauty. His teasing tone and the dancing amusement in his eyes make it clear he's at least partially having a laugh at her expense. At the same time though, he makes it clear he's serious when he beckons for her to back up a few steps. Gritting her teeth, Marjorie does as she's told by whirling around and advancing on Renly. It can't possibly be real Valyrian steel, can it? Where would you even get something like that? The sound of a sword being drawn from its sheath causes Marjorie to turn back before Renly can answer, her eyes beholding the incredibly beautiful sword with its distinctive ripples all along every inch of its surface. Renly chuckles from behind her. It's very real, I assure you. It had better be, given what it cost me. This was insane. Marjorie may not be a knight or anything like that, but even she knew the value of Valyrian steel. Especially a full Valyrian steel sword. They were said to be lighter, stronger, harder, and sharper than even the best castle-forged steel. They never dulled either, with people claiming that Valyrian steel swords hundreds of years old were as sharp as the day they were forged. They were also ludicrously, prohibitively expensive given that the place where they'd originally been forged hadn't existed for hundreds of years. It was in the name. Valyrian steel came from old Valyria, which had fallen long ago to the doom. These days, as far as Marjorie was aware, there was nobody left who knew how to forge more of the stuff. Instead, there were just a handful of blacksmiths in the whole world who even knew how to rework Valyrian steel. To put it into perspective, the only great house in all of Westeros that had a Valyrian steel sword was House Stark up in the north. Even Marjorie had heard about Ice, the ancestral two-handed greatsword of the dire wolves. Just as she also knew about Tywin Lannister's obsession with obtaining a Valyrian steel sword for his own house. The Lord of House Lannister was said to have offered amounts of coin to smaller houses that would damn near beggar even most of his peers, but to no avail. People weren't selling, and while one might assume that a great house would just be able to take one of their vassals' Valyrian steel swords if they wanted one, it wasn't quite that simple. In the end, there was such a stigma of dishonor around the concept that even the greedy Lord Tywin hadn't gone that far yet. All of this was to say, where the fuck had Renly gotten a Valyrian steel sword? And what exactly had he paid for it? His words about what it had cost him hang in the air, and even Loras, for all that her brother's head can be so empty at times, pauses and tears his eyes away from the sword he's holding to give Renly a look. What did this cost you, Renly? Raising an eyebrow, Renly lets out a bark of laughter. Oh, how quickly the gratitude fades. Loras flushes at that, looking ashamed of himself and ducking his head. Apologies, my king, I am extremely grateful for this gift. I don't know how I can possibly repay you. Renly just scoffs, waving a hand through the air. Repay me. You are my Lord Commander, Loras. You are sworn to protect my personhood until the day you die. Shall I ask my crown to repay me as it sits upon my brow? Shall I ask my clothes to repay me as they rest upon my body? You are as much a part of me as anything else. All I've done is make you more useful. Marjorie tries not to wrinkle her nose at Renly's words. She supposed they were supposed to be romantic, and given the way Loras is now making eyes at Renly, it seems that they might even have landed with her martially inclined brother. Still, she doesn't think she would be nearly as enthused about being compared to garments of all things. And, even if Loras wasn't going to press the issue, Marjorie felt like someone had to. This is truly a kingly gift, Your Majesty. Fit for the Lord Commander of your Rainbow Guard. And as his sister, I fully believe that Loras is worthy of this trust. Loras puffs up at her words, even as Renly lifts a single brow and smirks, waiting for the but to drop. However, I do have to ask where this sword came from. On such short notice too. After all, it's obvious that Renly had gotten Loras this sword for the trial by the Seven. How though? How had he managed to source Valyrian steel in such a short amount of time when neither House Baratheon nor House Tyrell had had an ancestral Valyrian steel sword between them for ages at this point? Not to toot her house's own horn too much or anything, but House Tyrell was easily one of the wealthiest, most powerful houses in the realm. Sure, the Lannisters were said to shit gold, but when winter came and bellies growled, it was the Reach that supplied food, and that could be worth far more than gold. Meanwhile, House Baratheon had been ascendant since the conquest, having long had connections to House Targaryen that saw them elevated even above the other Lord Paramounts from time to time. And yet, the Baratheons also could not claim to have an ancestral Valyrian steel blade. Renly's smile becomes a little bit fixed as he shakes his head. Ah, that is where your confusion stems from, my queen. You see, it was not on short notice that I procured this blade for your brother. No, I've been working on this for quite some time. As for the cost, do not worry too much about it. I will tell you both more once we win tomorrow. Until then, it is best that we focus on the trial ahead. And, of course, naming this fine blade. Loras' eyes widen all over again as he looks down at the Valyrian steel sword in his hands. It doesn't have a name yet. Grinning, Renly shakes his head. Not one that matters, no. I leave its naming up to you, Loras. You are its wielder, after all. Wielder, not owner. Marjorie catches it, even if Loras doesn't. Perhaps Renly thinks that the sword will one day revert back to House Baratheon but doesn't want to say as much right now. Her lips purse, but she's not about to ruin the moment by accusing him of such a thing. Loras hesitates for a long moment, staring down at the nameless blade reverently. Finally. Rosethorn. It will be called Rosethorn. Wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. Shall we go see what it can do? I'm sure we have some surplus or already damaged armor lying around to outfit a wooden post with, so you can give it a few swings before tomorrow. With that, Marjorie watches as Renly leads Loras out of the tent. She bites her lower lip as the two men depart. Truthfully, she's been left with more questions than answers, and was more uneasy now than ever before. For Renly to deflect not once but twice, just how much had that Valyrian steel sword cost? Or rather, how much would it cost them down the road once the throne was secured? Because Marjorie wasn't stupid. She knew full well that Renly didn't have access to the coin needed to buy such a thing. So what exactly had he offered instead? And, even if Loras said it was all just cowardice and lies, Marjorie can't help but wonder about Axel Baratheon and what he's truly capable of. One way or another, they'll all find out tomorrow, but that doesn't exactly give Marjorie any peace of mind. She could only hope everything would work out tomorrow. It had to, or they were all ruined. XXX. It seems like Marjorie is the only smart one in the enemy camp. But what did Renly promise for that sword? And to who? Reminder. You can find the full 122 chapters of this story under the title The Unyielding Stag, written by me on questionablequesting.com, hntai foundry.com, archiveofourown.com, and scribblehub.com.